The 9,380th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security in Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. I give the representative of the Russian Federation the floor.
Спасибо, господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Прежде чем вы утвердите повестку дня, я бы хотел выразить принципиальное несогласие с подходом председательства
with the approach of the presidency of inviting delegations to today's meeting under Rule 37.
В нарушение сложившейся
In breach of existing practice, the British presidency single-handedly decided to provide an opportunity to speak to 8 members states of the EU and NATO, as well as their close allies, as well as to the representative of the EU itself, despite the fact that, based on existing practice, meetings on Ukraine under Rule 37 include the participation of no more than 3 countries. Clearly, today's participants, guided by NATO's discipline, will not generate any added value for today's discussion, and yet it will be prolonged, transformed into debates which the United Kingdom did not agree upon with members of the Security Council. This approach not only attests to the unscrupulousness of the presidency, but also represents an attempt to exert pressure on the members of the Security Council. There are no and can be no reasonable explanation for the need to transform Security Council meeting into a NATO so-called hangout. But the British presidency has no concern apparently neither for its own reputation nor for the rules and traditions of the United Nations Security Council. It has not drawn any conclusions from even its own errors as president of the Security Council, errors which have accumulated significantly in the first half of the month of July. Let us recall that in the month of February, we encountered an attempt by one of the members of the EU presiding and attempting to transform a meeting on Ukraine into a political show directed to coincide with the visit of European ministers to New York, and we see the same today. Let us observe that London time after time demonstrates blatant disregard for the procedures and the practices of the Security Council, placing the national position and interests of NATO above the obligations as presidency of the UN Security Council, which has been entrusted with guardianship. I stress this guardianship of procedures and the conduct of balanced and impartial policy. Unfortunately, for the second consecutive year, this basic task was something which was beyond the capacity of British diplomats. Thank you.
The representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. Nothing more. The agenda is adopted. I would like to warmly welcome the distinguished ministers and other high representatives. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Austria, Denmark, Germany, Hungary, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Poland, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Olaf Skog, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Mr. President, Excellencies, over 500 days since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion, life in Ukraine remains a living hell, as the Secretary General characterized it. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, 9,287 civilians have been killed and 16,384 injured, most under Russian armed forces fire. This figure includes 537 children killed and 1,117 injured. And these are only confirmed figures. The actual number of victims is likely considerably higher. Children have been particularly hit hard by the conflict. Ukraine was the country with the highest number of children killed and maimed in 2022. It was also the country with the most attacks on schools and hospitals. Nowhere is safe in Ukraine. On 27 June, Russian missiles hit the city of Kramatorsk, reportedly killing 11 people, including 14-year-old twin sisters. At least 60 others were injured. On 6 July, bombardments hit Kyiv, Odessa, and Lviv, which are far from the front lines. On 8 July, Russian artillery shelling reportedly killed at least 8 civilians and wounded 13 in Lyman. And communities in the Sumy region continue to be under constant Russian shelling. Civilians in areas under Russian control also face mortal danger. On 9 July, 4 civilians were killed and many more injured while receiving humanitarian aid in the town of Orahiv, Zaporizhia region. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, wherever they may occur, are indefensible and strictly prohibited under international law. They must cease immediately. Mr. President, as the Secretary General has consistently underlined, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a blatant violation of the UN Charter and international law. The United Nations remains fully committed to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, in accordance with relevant General Assembly resolutions. The parties involved bear the responsibility to avoid actions that could further escalate tensions. In particular, any threat to use nuclear weapons is utterly unacceptable. So is jeopardizing the safety and security of nuclear power plants and other critical infrastructure. In recent days, experts of the International Atomic Energy Agency have heard a series of explosions apparently taking place some distance away from the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. They are a stark reminder of potential nuclear safety and security risks facing the facility during the military conflict in the country. Mr. President, the United Nations and humanitarian partners continue to respond to the dire consequences of the war, having reached over 5 million people with aid so far this year. There have been over 65 interagency convoys this year to frontline areas. Unfortunately, the continuing lack of humanitarian access to Russian-controlled areas of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions deprives an estimated 3.7 million people of much-needed assistance. We continue to engage the authorities in Moscow and Kyiv to secure access and urge Russia to fulfill its international obligations to grant humanitarian access to territories it controls. Access is also an issue in the wake of the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. The incident has devastated local communities along the Dnipro River and continues to have broad, long-term environmental consequences. The flooding affected local ecosystems, exposed military and hazardous waste, and shifted landmines. The UN is undertaking a post-disaster needs assessment to determine the wider impact in support of a comprehensive recovery strategy. Displacement throughout Ukraine remains a serious concern. Currently, more than 6.3 million Ukrainians are refugees, and an estimated 1.5 million people are internally displaced. According to the International Organization for Migration, an estimated 4.76 million displaced people have returned to their communities since the beginning of the war, including 1.1 million refugees. The High Commissioner for Refugees reports that while most of the remaining refugees and IDPs want to return to their places of origin, voluntary return in safety and dignity may not be possible for many, given the security situation. Indeed, Ukraine has become one of the most heavily mined countries in the world. As part of our support to the government of Ukraine for the reconstruction and repair of critical infrastructure, the UN is assisting the country's emergency services to remove over 500,000 landmines and pieces of unexploded ordnance, enabling 4 million people to return home. Mr. President, OHCHR has documented a harrowing record of human rights violations, including arbitrary deprivation of life, arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance, torture and ill treatment, and conflict-related sexual violence. According to the latest OHCHR report, the Russian Federation arbitrarily detained 864 individual cases, many cases amounting to forced disappearance. It is deeply disturbing that more than 91% of civilian detainees held by the Russian Federation were reportedly subjected to torture or ill treatment, including sexual violence. More than 26% of the detainees were transferred to other locations in violation of international law, either in Ukraine under Russian control or to the Russian Federation itself. We're also gravely concerned about the alleged summary execution of 77 civilians while they were arbitrarily detained by the Russian Federation, as reported by OHCHR. OHCHR has documented 75 cases of arbitrary detention by Ukrainian security forces, mostly of persons suspected of conflict-related criminal offenses. In 57% of the cases, OHCHR documented the use of torture and ill treatment. We call for the arbitrary detention of civilians to stop and for the immediate release in conditions of safety of all persons held arbitrarily. Victims must be provided with effective remedies. We also urge the Russian Federation to guarantee independent monitors, including those of OHCHR, regular, unimpeded, and confidential access to all detainees. All victims of human rights violations deserve justice and accountability, whichever side of the front line they come from. Impunity must not be allowed to stand. Mr. President, the Ukraine Recovery Conference in London last month was a demonstration of international solidarity, raising over $60 billion in pledges toward Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. The UN will continue to support national and international partners in ongoing recovery efforts following Building Back Better and Leaving No One Behind principles. Mr. President, globally in 2023, it's projected that 345 million people across 79 countries where the World Food Program is operational and data is available will experience acute food insecurity. Up to 40.4 million people across 51 countries face severe hunger emergencies and are one step away from falling into famine if they do not receive immediate assistance. The Black Sea Initiative enabled the safe export of some 33 million metric tons of foodstuffs from 3 Ukrainian ports, including more than 750,000 metric tons of wheat transported by WFP, helping to relieve hunger in Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa, and Yemen. The initiative helped bring down global food prices. The Memorandum of Understanding on Russian food and fertilizer exports also delivered concrete results over the past year. As the Secretary General stated this morning, the decision of the Russian Federation to terminate the Black Sea Initiative will strike a blow to people in need everywhere. The Secretary General also stated that this decision will not stop our efforts to facilitate the unimpeded access to global markets for food products and fertilizers from both Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Mr. President, we knew well before 24 February 2022 that the world was at an inflection point. We understood that we needed to take urgent action to deal with an overwhelming set of crises that, collectively, threaten our very existence. International cooperation and respect for the rule of law were more important than ever. Today, it is clear that, in addition to causing unconscionable death and destruction, The war in Ukraine has greatly diminished our ability to face an uncertain future. It has heightened tensions in different regions and risks triggering a global arms race. The war threatens to undermine the very structures that prevented a third global conflagration and helped us resolve multiple conflicts over the last 80 years. The longer this war continues, the more dangerous its consequences, including the possibility of a wider conflict. For the sake of the Ukrainian people and for the sake of our global community, this senseless, unjustified war must stop. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Carlo for her briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. More than 500 days have now passed since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. At least 9,000 innocent civilians lie dead, including 500 children. Thousands more Ukrainians have been kidnapped, imprisoned, and tortured. Homes, businesses, schools, and hospitals have been reduced to rubble. Russia's incessant attacks have knocked out 60% of Ukraine's power supply. This war has claimed countless victims. I'm going to focus on those who have been forcibly deported in this war and those who are going hungry as a result of it. In Kyiv last month, I met a teenage boy. I will call him Dennis. When the Russians captured his hometown, they told Dennis and his classmates that they were going to go on a holiday. They were, in fact, transported to a Russian camp where they were neglected, indoctrinated, and abused. Dennis's distraught mother was desperately searching for him, but the Russians, pretending to look after Dennis and countless others, told him his parents had abandoned him. The boy's ordeal lasted for 7 months before his mother, thanks to the charity Save Ukraine, found him and brought him home. But 19,000 Ukrainian children remain in Russian camps, and their parents are desperately searching for them. A further 2.5 million Ukrainian men and women have been deported to Russia. These are barbaric crimes. Russia is trying to erase Ukrainian identity and cultural history, and they are using children as an instrument of war. But the world is watching, and Russia will be held accountable. We welcome the International Criminal Court's investigation, and we will leave no stone unturned until the responsible are brought to justice. Ukrainians are Russians' principal victims, but this war is also harming the poor and the vulnerable across the world, particularly in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America. Energy prices rocketed by 20% worldwide last year, almost doubling global inflation from 4.7% to 8.7%. World food supplies have fallen sharply. Ukrainian food exports, maize, barley, or wheat, have plummeted by more than 40%, with catastrophic consequences for sub-Saharan Africa, which relies on these supplies. Food prices are rocketing by a staggering 332% in Lebanon last summer. Some of these losses were offset by the Black Sea Grain Initiative, brokered by the UN Secretary-General and Turkey. But today, Russia has announced it is refusing to extend it and is taking a colossal 23 million tons of Ukrainian food off of world markets over the forthcoming year. As the UN Secretary-General said this morning, today's decision by the Russian Federation will strike a blow to the people in need everywhere. And we call on Russia to return to the table and agree to extend the Black Sea Grain Initiative indefinitely and to implement it fully without delay. Let us be clear. Russia's actions are taking food out of the mouths of the poorest people across Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. We cannot allow this war to go on for another 500 days. The UN General Assembly has called repeatedly for peace, a peace that is based on the principles of the UN Charter and our shared belief that might does not equal right. President Zelensky's 10-point plan has shown a way forward. Ukraine wants peace. We want peace. The whole world wants peace. Peace will bring home Ukraine's lost children and feed the hungry of the world. Peace will keep the promises we all made in the UN Charter, and peace will pave the way to a reformed multilateral system. And peace will help deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. A just and lasting peace is what we all want. The Russian Federation can choose peace today by withdrawing all Russian forces from Ukraine. Mr. Putin, bring your troops home. End this war now. I now resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Catherine Colonna, Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of the Republic of France.
Monsieur le Président, notre Conseil s'était réuni à niveau ministériel le 24 février dernier, après 365 jours d'une guerre abominable, choisie par la seule Russie. La veille, l'Assemblée générale lui avait à nouveau demandé de cesser son agression. Mais elle continue. Cela fait désormais plus de 500 jours qu'elle mène une guerre d'agression contre l'Ukraine. 500 jours qu'elle détruit.
For 500 days, it has been destroying, bombing, and deliberately targeting civilian populations and infrastructure. For 500 days, it has been committing atrocities and war crimes, abducting and deporting thousands of children, using rape as a weapon of war, torturing and killing. This is 500 days too many.
Nous avons fondé les Nations Unies au sortir de la Seconde Guerre mondiale.
We founded the United Nations at the end of the Second World War with a collective commitment to ensure that the horrors of war would never happen again, to prioritize the peaceful settlement of disputes and to respect common rules and principles that govern relations between states. These are the principles and the rules that Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, with, in this regard, a special responsibility, has chosen to violate by attacking a neighboring country for no reason. What is at stake in Ukraine concerns all our states. Firstly, because this aggression, by openly calling into question the fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter, creates a risk of setting a precedent. And secondly, because the way in which we respond to it will largely determine our collective stability and security for decades to come. All of those who might be tempted to think that this war is too far away, that it's a European affair, that it doesn't concern them, should realize this. If we accept might prevailing over right, sovereignty and territorial integrity being flouted with impunity, the aggressor and the aggressed being placed on an equal footing, then we will be contributing to creating the conditions for other wars. Let there be no doubt. If we allow this aggression to be rewarded, there will be other aggressions, there or elsewhere.
Si cette guerre nous concerne tous ici, c'est aussi parce que ses conséquences pèsent lourdement sur les populations du monde entier, notamment celles des pays les plus pauvres et les plus vulnérables. Et que l'agression russe a trop de conséquences négatives. Pendant que la Russie prétend être solidaire, mais ne propose rien pour venir en aide aux autres. Nous avons organisé à Paris les 22 et 23 juin un sommet pour un nouveau pacte financier mondial qui a permis des résultats concrets, y compris sur la gestion de la dette. Et a permis de tracer une dynamique claire pour mobiliser des financements à destination des pays qui en ont le plus besoin. Pendant que la Russie déploie ses milices
While Russia
pour piller les
deploys its
ressources du
militias
continent
to plunder the
africain,
resources of the
la
African
France a accru ses
continent,
partenariats pour le développement
France has
et est
increased its
devenue le
development
quatrième bailleur
partnerships and
mondial d'aide
become the
publique.
world's fourth largest donor of
Et pendant
official
que la Russie
aid.
exerce un chantage
While Russia is
inacceptable à la
unacceptably
reconduction de
subjecting
l'initiative
the
céréalière de
renewal
la
of the
mer
Black
Noire,
Sea Grain
alors que
Initiative
c'est
to
elle
blackmail,
qui entrave la
and while
liberté de
it is Russia
circulation
that is
en mer
hindering
Noire,
freedom of movement in the Black
l'Union
Sea,
européenne poursuit
the
et
European
améliore ces
Union
corridors de
is pursuing and
solidarité qui
improving
ont
its
permis
solidarity
d'exporter plus
corridors,
de
which have
38 millions
enabled the
de tonnes
export of
de
more than
céréales.
38 million tons of grain.
Monsieur le Président, après 500 jours
President,
d'une guerre
after
d'agression
500 days
illégale,
of an illegal,
injustifiable
unjustifiable,
et vouée à
and
l'échec,
doomed war
il
of
est
aggression,
essentiel que nous renforcions
it's
notre
essential
mobilisation
that we
pour la paix.
step up our rallying
Je
behind the
tiens de
cause
ce
of
point de
peace.
vue à saluer les nombreuses initiatives
In this
qui se
respect,
sont fait
I
jour
would like to
au cours des
welcome the
dernières
many
semaines.
initiatives that have emerged in recent
Elles montrent que
weeks.
l'attachement à l'idéal qui a fondé les
They
Nations
show that
Unies
the commitment to the
reste
ideal on which the
largement
UN was
partagé.
founded remains largely
Mais nos
shared.
efforts n'auront de sens que s'ils permettent de créer les
But our
conditions d'une
efforts will
paix
only be
juste et
meaningful if they
durable,
create the
dans le
conditions
respect
for a
des
just
principes
and lasting
fondamentaux de la
peace,
Charte,
respecting the
que
fundamental
sont la
principles of the
souveraineté
Charter,
et
that
l'intégrité
is, the
territoriale des
sovereignty and
États.
territorial integrity of states.
Soyons lucides. Toute
Let us be
solution
clear.
conduisant à entériner les
Any
annexions
solution
illégales
leading to
de
the
pans entiers du
ratification of
territoire
the
ukrainien
illegal
par la Russie
annexation
ne ferait
of
que
whole
poser des
swathes
jalons
of
de
Ukrainian
conflits
territory
futurs.
by Russia would only pave the way
Penser
for
le
future
contraire serait une
conflicts.
funeste erreur.
Thinking otherwise would be a
À cette
fatal
agression qui a
error.
violé tous les principes en lesquels nous
We
croyons
must
ici aux Nations Unies,
respond to
nous devons répondre par des solutions fondées
this
sur le droit
aggression,
et la
which has
justice.
violated all the principles in which we
C'est la raison
believe
pour
here at the
laquelle
United
la lutte
Nations,
contre
with
l'impunité
solutions
pour les
based
crimes
on
commis par
law
la
and
Russie en
justice.
Ukraine est si importante.
That's why the fight against
C'est la
impunity
raison
for
pour
the
laquelle la
crimes committed
sûreté
by Russia
et
in
la
Ukraine is so
sécurité des
important.
installations
And that's why
nucléaires
the safety
civiles
and security
ukrainiennes
of
est une
Ukraine's
priorité,
civilian nuclear
alors que la Russie les
facilities
met en
is a
danger de façon
priority at a time when
irresponsable
Russia is
en
irresponsibly
occupant
endangering
Zaporizhzhia.
them by occupying Zaporizhia.
Nous resterons aussi engagés pour la
We
protection
will
des
also remain
civils
committed to the
et pour
protection
venir
of
en aide auprès
civilians
de
and
18
to
millions
helping
de
the
personnes
nearly
qui ont besoin
18 million
d'assistance
people who need
humanitaire en
humanitarian
Ukraine.
assistance in Ukraine.
L'Ukraine, pays agressé alors qu'elle ne menaçait en rien la
Ukraine,
Russie,
a country that was
continue
attacked when it
pourtant à
posed
chercher le
no threat
dialogue
whatsoever to
et à
Russia,
placer
continues to
l'ensemble
seek
de ces
dialogue and has
principes au
placed
cœur
all these
de sa
principles at the
vision pour
heart
la
of its
paix,
vision for peace,
répétée
which has
avec
been
constance
constantly
depuis l'an dernier.
reiterated since
Et
last
c'est la
year.
raison pour laquelle nous la soutenons.
And that is why we
Ce
support it.
soutien durera
This
aussi
support will
longtemps
endure
qu'il le
for
faudra.
as long as necessary.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Colonna for her statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Linda Thomas Greenfield, Permanent Representative of the United States of America and member of President Biden's cabinet.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Undersecretary General DiCarlo, for your briefing. As I prepared for today's meeting, I thought back to the days leading up to President Putin's unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This was just over 500 days ago. For weeks, the United States, alongside many countries represented in this room, had been sounding the alarm about Russia's imminent invasion. But all Russia did was deny, deny, deny. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister told us to stop the hysteria. But only a few days later, we were all here in this room, in this very council, when Russia launched its brutal war of aggression. That night, President Biden delivered a message that would prove prescient. He said that Putin's war of choice, and I quote, will bring a catastrophic loss of life and human suffering, unquote. Tragically, the world has watched this play out in horrifying detail in Ukraine and around the world. After all, the spillover effect of this needless war are profound. Just look at the harm Russia has done to the world's food supply. By weaponizing food, Russia has exacerbated the global food security crisis, a crisis that disproportionately impacts people in the Middle East and Africa. And today, in another act of cruelty, Russia suspended its participation in the Black Sea Grain Initiative. This arrangement has brought stability to global food markets and lowered food prices for all. It has bolstered the World Food Programme's humanitarian work in places like Afghanistan, Somalia, and Yemen. And according to the UN, nearly 2/3 of the wheat exported through this arrangement has gone to developing countries. As the Secretary General said, quote, "Today's decision by the Russian Federation will strike a blow to people in need everywhere," unquote. Of course, this decision follows Russia's callous veto of a compromise Security Council resolution that would have extended life-saving assistance to Syrians in dire need. In both cases, Russia's cynicism is instructing the will of this council, and it's obstructing the recommendations of the Secretary General. We must all urge Russia to extend the cross-border mechanism into Syria and continue its participation in the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Colleagues, over the past 500 days, Russia has waged a campaign of brutality on the Ukrainian people. Russia's forces have rained missiles down on Ukraine, causing unconscionable death and destruction. We've all seen the images of burned out homes and schools and playgrounds. Russia's forces have tortured civilians in detention, including through beatings, electrocution, and mock executions. One woman I met in Kyiv could only share a portion of the horrors she experienced while in detention. It was still too raw, but the pain etched onto her face said it all. The United States has determined that members of Russia's forces and other Russian officials have committed crimes against humanity in Ukraine. Rape, summary executions, the deportation of Ukrainians, including children. The list goes on. Russia continues to deny these atrocities. These crimes have been well documented, and the international community has taken steps to hold those responsible to account, and there will be justice. On the night of the invasion, President Biden also said the United States and our allies would respond in a united and decisive way, and this too has been borne out. We have stood united, never wavering, in our support for Ukraine. Together, we have imposed sanctions on individuals and entities that provide political and economic support to Russia's war efforts. And together, we have provided and will continue to provide Ukraine with humanitarian and security assistance. Now you hear our Russian colleagues say that somehow this assistance is the reason the war continues. But once again, Russia is trying to turn reality on its head. The security assistance, including weapons, the United States and more than 50 other countries are providing is for Ukraine's self-defense. Self-defense to which Ukraine has an inherent right, as reflected in Article 51 of the UN Charter. The truth of the matter is this: Russia could end this war today by pulling out its troops. It's that simple. And you've heard that from several of us in this room. Colleagues, the United States refuses to give up on the urgency of peace. And that's why, along with Ukraine and other member states, we supported the UN General Assembly's resolution that called for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. Russia tried to bully countries into voting against this resolution, but its efforts were in vain. Over 140 member states made clear that peace must be rooted in the UN Charter, in the fundamental principles of sovereignty, equality, and territorial integrity of states. But up to this point, Russia has shown no true interest in a just and durable peace. And as a result, the Ukrainian people continue to suffer. The world continues to suffer. I suspect, actually I know, Russia will continue to follow its standard playbook and deny the truth about its war of aggression. It will continue to call bogus council meetings and invite conspiracy theorists to brief us. It truly is shameful. But what cannot be denied is this: the Ukrainian people will continue to courageously defend their country. And the United States will stand with them for as long as it takes, just as we will continue to stand up for the UN Charter and its principles as the basis for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Her Excellency Miss Thomas Greenfield for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Shunsuke Takei, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for calling this important meeting. I also thank Undersecretary General DiCarlo for the briefing. And welcome the participation for Foreign Minister Kuleba of Ukraine on this meeting. Mr. President, I condemn Russia for taking the rest of the world hostage. It is deeply regrettable that Russia chose to terminate the Black Sea Grain Initiative and blames others for the crisis it has created by its aggression. Japan condemns Russia's aggression against Ukraine in the strongest possible terms. Russia must immediately and unconditionally withdraw its forces from Ukraine and respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity with its internationally recognized borders. Japan will stand with Ukraine as it defends itself for a just and lasting peace. We should not tolerate the clear violation of the UN Charter. The same applies anywhere in the world. If a permanent member of the Security Council unilaterally attempts to change the status quo of territories of its neighbors by force or coercion, it should be held accountable and face consequences commensurate with their privileges. Mr. President, Russia abuses the veto power. The veto is not for impunity. It should embody heavy responsibilities of the permanent members. In this regard, Japan welcomes the commitment of France, the UK, and the US to voluntarily refrain from use of the veto. I hope that the remaining permanent members will join them. Russia is trying to threaten the world with irresponsible nuclear rhetoric, the deployment of the nuclear weapons in Belarus, and the seizure of the militarization of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plants. Japan cannot accept Russia's nuclear threats, let alone its use of nuclear weapons under any circumstances. Mr. President, we have admitted that the credibility of the Council is eroding. The Security Council should be reformed to restore the trust of the international community and represent the world of today, not the world of 80 years ago. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Takei for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me thank Rosemary for the insightful briefing, as always, with accurate and indisputable information on the matter. We thank the UK Presidency for convening this high-level meeting on the situation of Ukraine and welcome you, Foreign Secretary, on the chair. After more than 500 days of ongoing war in Ukraine, what we have said since the very beginning of this lunacy remains true. It is an unjust and unjustifiable war of choice, a one-man-made catastrophe, a pure act of aggression. During all this time, in our almost weekly debates, we have heard everything and its contrary. We have seen officials declare here pompously, looking straight into the eyes of the Security Council members that there will be no war. And it was a lie, and everyone knows, including everyone in the Global South. Then, when war began, they rushed to specify that it was only a special military operation, otherwise an aggression. Then they claimed that Russia never commits crimes despite overwhelming and sickening evidence of cruelty, which has, among others, led the ICC to issue arrest warrants for the top leadership. Then they claimed that Russia never attacks civilian infrastructure, except for the residential areas, shopping malls, power generation installations, health facilities, schools, and kindergartens, and everything else. If Samuel Beckett were alive, he would be jealous. The theater of absurd is thriving in Russia. Russian propaganda has never lost an occasion to claim that despite all the devastating consequences of the war, there were no facts and everything was staged by Ukraine, pushed by the Western hysteria. Until a Russian in the highest Kremlin circles of power, the infamous leader of the notorious Wagner Group, the assembly line of atrocities, a killing machine 100% owned and financed by the government to do the dirty job, would come out and claim that the invasion of Ukraine was nothing less and nothing more than, and I quote, a racket perpetrated by a corrupt elite chasing money and glory without concern for the Russian lives. They've said it. Hard to do better with more accuracy. Colleagues, we have heard so many times that Russia is falling out with the international rules-based order. They claim repeatedly that they do not agree with it and they want out. I think it's important to understand what this is all about. The rules-based international order, which my country, Albania, and the overwhelming majority of the world, and 143 at the last count in the General Assembly, want and protect, is everything we have commonly built over 78 years together, bit by bit, to shift from the culture of war to the shared desire for peace and cooperation. It relies on the foundations of the Charter of the UN, in the dozens of conventions and treaties, the countless UN Security Council and UNGA resolutions, court rulings, all that precious international legislation that we commonly call the international law. It is the order where, despite their wealth and might, nations are equal, free to decide on their choice and their future, where relations between states are based on friendship and respect and genuine efforts to achieve mutual benefits, where rules and commitments are respected and observed, where we all, including Russia, have committed to work for peace, not preparing for the next war. It is the international order that Russia doesn't want anymore, because it wants to evolve against instead of together, because it wants to dictate the geopolitical choices of others, including Ukraine, because it wants to impose its imperial ambitions and consolidate the influence of what they call the near abroad, in what they see and call again the Russian world. Last year, food insecurity sent shock tremors across the world until the Black Sea Initiative was put in place. Now Russia just ended it, gambling again with the needs and food of people in need. It is for everyone to judge. Colleagues, Russia's massive assault on a sovereignty country threatens not only Europe, it assaults the astonishing human effort we all have invested since World War II to build global peace through the international rule of law. Let's make it clear. The defeat of Russia in Ukraine doesn't mean the end of Russia. It means the end of aggression and transgression of rules established and accepted globally in favor of a sustainable peace in Europe and the world. Instead, a victory of Russia signifies the prevalence of imperial powers, the sanction of war as a means to dominate its neighbors. We don't want any of this, and we cannot accept it. This is why support for Ukraine must continue until Russia understands that its logic of force has failed. And including, Mr. President, by reverting to a lesson of history, which tells that wars, however long, do not last forever. And Russia's war of choice will end as well. The sooner, the better for all, for Ukrainians and for Russia itself. This is why the door of diplomacy should remain open. We fully support the Ukraine's peace formula for a comprehensive, just and sustainable peace. It should respect the independence, territorial integrity, and sovereignty of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders as protected by international law and the UN Charter. Any other solution will not lead to a lasting peace, but only to a postponement of conflict. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, I'd like to thank Undersecretary General DiCarlo for her informative briefing and express my appreciation to you, Foreign Secretary Cleverly, for presiding over this meeting. I also welcome the other distinguished ministers and high-level representatives who have joined us today. The toll that the war in Ukraine is exacting on civilians is enormous. Further afield, the consequences of conflict have reverberated across the globe. Since the Black Sea Grain Initiative and the Memorandum of Understanding on the export of Russian fertilizers and food products were agreed almost 1 year ago, they have had significant impact globally. The shift in the price of grain following the announcement of the initiative's termination this morning reflects its importance. The UAE regrets that the agreement will not continue, and Ukrainian food items will struggle to reach those who depend on them. Though this remains a political decision, it is the most vulnerable who are now forced to grapple with the very real consequences of the decision. The initiative is one of the few positives that have emerged in the context of this conflict. These agreements were born out of a resolute commitment to dialogue, and it is our hope that dialogue will prevail among the parties. Mr. President, the world has witnessed more than 500 days of suffering since the beginning of the war. It is difficult to convey the true cost of this conflict. One can speak of the millions who have been displaced, the tens of thousands killed and injured, and the impossible situation faced by those living amidst the shifting front lines. One can speak of the destruction wrought by the war and the long journey towards reconstruction that awaits Ukraine. One can also speak of the intangible impacts, the broken families, the uprooted communities, and the traumatized children. All will last long after the last bullet is fired. Since the outbreak of war, the World Health Organization has recorded more than 1,000 attacks on healthcare in Ukraine, including on medical facilities, personnel, and their means of transport. We reiterate our call on the parties to respect their obligations under international law. We underline the demand made by this Council in Resolution 2286 that all parties to armed conflict ensure the respect and protection of all medical personnel, their means of transport and equipment, as well as hospitals and other medical facilities. In the last week alone, there have been 2 instances of humanitarian aid workers coming under fire in Kharkiv and Zaporozhye. We urge all relevant authorities to facilitate the life-saving work of humanitarian organizations. This is especially important at a time when humanitarian needs remain significant and civilians are facing continued interruptions to power supplies across the country. For its part, the UAE is distributing $100 million of aid for Ukraine, including the provision of generators and LED lights for civilians, supplies for babies, as well as a grant of $4 million for programs supporting the welfare of orphan children under the Olena Zelenska Foundation. The UAE will continue its humanitarian efforts to help alleviate suffering on the ground. Mr. President, today's announcement is disappointing, but it should not dissuade our collective efforts to bring the war to an end. The United Arab Emirates will continue to call for this and support all genuine efforts to mitigate the war's consequences. De-escalation and dialogue are necessary to achieve a sustainable and just peace, a peace that is in line with the UN Charter and respects Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Mr. President, it has been 510 days since the war against Ukraine began. Regrettably, today, we are less close to finding a resolution to the conflict than when it started, and deepening differences may cause widespread and long-term damage to multilateralism and our shared ambition for global peace and security. Already, we have seen several thousand lives lost on both sides, whole cities that have been destroyed, safeguards against nuclear facilities that have been jeopardized, amplified and reckless rhetoric on nuclear weapons that have risked lowering the threshold of its use, and the proliferation and use of dangerous weapons that have rolled back our collective ambitions on arms control. The impact of the brutal war on Ukraine has not been limited to its suffering masses. It has cast its dark shadow across the world, aggravating the socioeconomic conditions of many countries that were already reeling from the adverse effect of the COVID-19 pandemic. Evolving national security doctrines are also responding to the war in Ukraine in ways that do not necessarily support the strengthening of our collective security. Mr. President, as I thank the United Kingdom for organizing this meeting and welcome the briefing by USG Rosemary DiCarlo, I appeal that the gaps between the expectations of 1945 and the reality of today should be a reminder of the further efforts all of us need to take in amplifying the voice of peace and establishing credible pathways of dialogue to help Ukraine and the Russian Federation to stop this needless war. On our part, Ghana has three main points that it would like to highlight for this meeting. First, we emphasize the need for the parties to heed the calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities. The militarization of the conflict, fueled by the manifest combative choices of the parties, has not significantly changed the dynamics of the conflict on the ground. Constrained by the absence of a common message from this Council, it is well past time for the parties to heed to the voice of the 11th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly, which in all its resolutions called for an immediate end to the war in favor of a peaceful settlement. Secondly, bearing in mind the civilian casualties, gross violations of human rights, and the extensive destruction that has accompanied the war, we are compelled to reiterate to the warring parties the obligation to strictly comply with international law, including international humanitarian law, especially the requirement to make a distinction of non-combatant populations to avoid harming them, as well as the facilities critical to their survival. Targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure is morally unacceptable and constitutes violation of international humanitarian law and human rights law. We also urge Ukraine and the Russian Federation to embrace the 5 concrete principles put forward by the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency to preserve the safety and security of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. We express appreciation for the coordinated humanitarian response spearheaded by the United Nations humanitarian agencies and international partners, as their efforts have been vital in assuring the people of Ukraine that they have not been forgotten by the rest of the world. Thirdly, to manage the adverse impact of the war in Ukraine on third states, it is important that every grain produced should be able to reach the global market. In this regard, we are deeply disappointed that the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which has since its commencement in July 2022, delivered over 32 million tons of food commodities to 45 countries, has not been renewed. A renewal of the initiative, accompanied by a resolution of the challenges with the export of ammonia to global markets, as well as of Russian agricultural products and fertilizers, envisaged by the MOU between the Russian Federation and the United Nations, would help prevent speculative spikes in global food prices, strengthen global food security, and prevent other knock-on effects. Mr. President, in closing, allow me to reiterate the futility of the use of force as an instrument to pursue relations with other states in the present era. It has not served the interests of others well, and it would not do so in the present circumstance. Our common renunciation of war in Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the Charter reflects the firm position of the international community on the matter, and our expectation that this obligation and other moderating voices would drive us to seek a path of lasting and comprehensive peace for Ukraine and the Russian Federation through dialogue and diplomacy. Finally, I reiterate Ghana's commitment of support for the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Our commitment remains undiminished. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President,
乌克兰危机爆发至今，
since
日益
its
呈现
outbreak,
长期化、
the
扩大
Ukrainian
化和
crisis
复
has
杂化
become
趋势。
increasingly protracted,
战
expanded,
争的
and
残酷性
complex,
危险
with
性和
ever
不可
more
预测性
cruelty,
不断上
danger,
升。
and
国际社会应当
unpredictability.
共同努力，
The international
全力防
community
止
should work
局势
together
失
to
控，
prevent the
早
situation
日
from
实
getting
现
out of
停火
control,
止战。
achieve a
推动
ceasefire and
问题
cessation of war
政治
sooner
解决。
to promote a political settlement of the issue.
我讲4点：
I have 4 points to say.
第一，
First,
要加大劝和促谈
we
力
must
度。
step up efforts to promote
战场
talks for
形势演
peace.
变表明，
The evolution of
军
the
事手
battlefield
段
shows
无法
that
解决乌
military
克兰
means
危机。
cannot solve the Ukrainian crisis,
冲突持续
and the
只会给平
continuation
民
of
带来
conflict
更多苦
will
难，
only bring more suffering to civilians,
甚至可能造
and
成
may
难
even
以预
lead
料、
to
无法挽回
unpredictable
的局
and
面。
irreparable situations.
危机无论持续多久，
No matter how
最
long
终
the
都要
crisis
通过政治
lasts,
手
it
段
will
来解决。
eventually be solved
一
through
段时间
political
以来，
means.
支持
For
重
some
启
time
和
now,
谈的理性声
rational
音
voices
越来越
supporting
强
the。resumption of
来
talks
自亚洲、
have
非
become
洲
stronger and
和拉
stronger.
丁美洲
Developing
的发
countries
展中
from
国家
Asia, Africa,
都
and
提出
Latin
了和平
America
倡议，
have all put forward peace
内容虽不尽
proposals.
相同，
Though different in
但都
contents,
体
they
现
all
了通过
reflect
政
a
治手
strong
段解
desire
决
to
危机
resolve
的
the crisis
强烈
through
意愿。
political means.
冲突双方
Both parties
要
to the
相向而
conflict
行，
should work
探
together
讨
to
照顾
meet
彼
each
此
other
关切，
halfway, to
符合
explore
地区实际，
solutions that accommodate
有
each
助于
other's
弥合
concerns
分歧的
that
解决
correspond
方
to
案。
regional realities and that
国际
can
社
help
会要
bridge
共同努力，
differences. The
为停
international
火
community should
创
work
造必要
together to
条
create
件，
the necessary
为
conditions
和
for
谈
ceasefire
营
and
造
create
良
a
好氛
favorable
围。
atmosphere for peace talks.
乌克兰危机是欧洲
The Ukrainian
安全
crisis
矛盾的
is a
总爆
major
发，
outbreak of security frictions
有
in
许多
Europe.
值得深刻总结
There are
反思的
many
教训。
lessons worth of profound
危机
reflection.
再次证明，追求
and
绝对
thinking.
安全、挑
The
动阵
crisis
营
once
对
again
抗、
proves that
扩
the
张军事
pursuit
集
of
团的
absolute
陈旧思
security,
维和
inciting
危
bloc
险做法，
confrontation, expanding
只能给
military
欧洲
alliance,
乃至整个世界
outdated way of
带来
thinking
动
and
荡
dangerous
和不安。
practices that can only bring turmoil and
危
anxiety
机
to
的最终
Europe
解
and the
决
whole world.
关
The
键还是
key
要
to
秉
the
持
ultimate
共
solution
同、
of the
综合、
crisis is to
合
uphold a
作、
common,
可
comprehensive,
持续的闯关，
cooperative, and sustainable
推动构
security
建
vision,
均衡、
and
有效、
promote the
可
construction of
持
a
续的
balanced,
欧
effective,
洲
and
安全架构。
sustainable European security architecture.
第二，
Second,
要管控危机
we
的
must
外溢影
control the
响。
spillover effects of the
疫
crisis.
情后的世界经
The
济本
recovery
就
of the
复苏
world
乏力，
economy after the
乌克兰危机
pandemic
同其
has
他
been
因素相互
sluggish.
作用
The
叠
Ukrainian
加，
crisis has
给全球发
interacted
展
with other
造成
factors
巨
and
大
has
冲
dealt
击，
a severe blow to
使
global
全球粮
development,
食、能
bring
源、金
fragility
融
to
安全
global
更
food,
加脆弱。
energy, and financial
发
security,
展中国家实现可持续发
and
展目
developing
标
countries
面临更多困难。
face more difficulties in achieving
我们应
sustainable
该将
development
有
goals.
限的财力、
We
精
should
力
devote our limited
投入到
financial
应
resources
对全球共同
to
挑战中
addressing
去。
common global challenges.
有关国家
The
应
countries
立即
concerned
停止 should
immediately stop
和长
abusive
臂管
use
辖，
of military
保障
of
全球
unilateral
产业链
sanctions and
供应链
long-term
安全畅通，
long-arm jurisdiction to
并
ensure
加大
safe
对
and
发展中
smooth
国家的
global
支持
industrial chains
和
and
援助
supply
力度，
chains. We should increase
多做
support
有利于
and
世界经济
assistance
增
to
长的事。
developing countries and do more things that are conducive
中方
toward
赞赏
economic
黑海
growth.
粮食运输一
China
揽子
appreciates
协
the
议
important role
对
of the
稳定
Black
全球
Sea
粮
Grain
食市场的
Transportation
重要
Package
作用。
Agreement in stabilizing world
希望有
food
关方面
markets
通过
and
对
hope
话
that
协
relevant
商，
parties can
妥
properly
善解决
resolve the Black
黑
Sea
海
grain
粮食运输问题。
transportation issue through dialogue and consultation.
第三，
Third,
要全力应对人道危
utmost
机。
efforts should be made to respond to
旷日
humanitarian
持久的冲
crisis.
突使数百万民众流离失所，
Millions of people were
多处
displaced
重
by
要
the
大型基
protracted
础设施
conflict,
被毁。
and many important large
冲突当事
infrastructures
方
were
要严格
destroyed.
遵守国际人
Parties
道
to a
法，
conflict should
严格
strictly
遵
abide
循
by
必要、
international
区
humanitarian
分
law,
和对称的原
strictly
则，
follow the principles
保
of
护平民和
necessity,
民用基础设
differentiation,
施，
and
提供
proportionality,
快速、
protect
安全、
civilians and
无障碍的人道救
civilian
助，
infrastructures, provide
全力
rapid,
减轻
safe, and
平民遭受的
unhindered
苦难。
humanitarian access, and spare no effort to
妇女儿童
eliminate
是
the
武装
suffering
冲
of
突中最
civilians.
脆弱的群
Women
体，
and children
要
are the
给
most
予
vulnerable
特殊
groups
照
in
顾。
armed conflict and should be given
中
special
方鼓励
care.
国际社会和人
China
道机构
encourages the
在
international
恪守人
community
道
and
救援原则
humanitarian
基础上，
agencies
加
on
大
the
对
basis
受
of
危机影
abiding
响
by
民众
principles
的
of
人道救援
humanitarian
力度。
relief to step up humanitarian
不
assistance
负
to
责任的
people
转让
affected
集
by
束炸弹
crisis. The
极易引
irresponsible
发
transfer
人
of
道主义
cluster
问题，
bombs can easily give rise to
应
humanitarian
当平衡
issues.
处理人道主义关切
Humanitarian
和
concerns
正
and
当的军事安全
legitimate
需要，
military security needs should
对
be
转让
handled
集
in a
束炸弹
balanced way.
持慎
Prudence
重
and
克制的
restraint
态
should
度。
be exercised in the transfer of cluster bombs.
第四，
Fourth,
要确保核安全安保。
nuclear safety and security must
扎
be
波罗热核
ensured.
电站及附
Zaporozhye
近地区军
nuclear
事
power
风
plant
险
and
一
the
直有
nearby
增无
area
减。
have seen increasing military
近日
risks.
再度
And
传出爆
recently,
炸声
it's
响，
been said
令人深
explosion
感
was
担忧。
heard again from those areas, which
我
is
们再次
deeply
呼吁
worrying.
冲突
We
双方
once again
保
call
持
on
最大
both
的
parties
理
of the
性
conflict
克制，
to remain rational
遵守
and
核安全公约等
maintain
国际法，
restraint as
坚决避免
much
出
as
现人为
possible
核事故。
by nuclear safety
中
conventions
方
and
支
other
持国际原子
international
能机
laws
构
and
继续同各
steadfastly
方保持
avoid
接
man-made
触，
nuclear
为
accidents.
保障
China
乌克兰
supports
核设
IAEA
施
in
安全安
continuing
保
to
发挥
maintain
建
contact
设性
with
作
all
用。
parties and play a constructive role in ensuring the
中方
safety and
始终主
security
张，
of Ukraine's
核武
nuclear
器用
facilities.
不得，
China has
核战
always
争
maintained
打
that
不得，
nuclear weapons should not be
一
used
直呼
and
吁
that nuclear wars
全力
cannot be
阻
won
遏
and should
冲
never
突
be fought.
升级
We have been
演
calling
变为
for
核
all
危
efforts
机。
to prevent escalation of conflict into nuclear crisis.
朱毅先生，
Mr. President,
在乌克兰问题
on
上
the，issue of
中方
Ukraine,
始终主张各
China's
国主权、
consistent
领土
position
完
has
整
been
都应
that
得到维护，
sovereignty and territorial
联
integrity
合
of
国
all
宪章
countries should
宗
be
旨和原则
safeguarded.
都
The
应得到
purposes and
遵守，
principles of the Charter
各
of
国
the
合理
UN
安
should
全
be
关切都应得到重
complied
视。
with, and the
一切
legitimate
有利于
security
和平解
concerns
决
of
危
all
机的努
parties
力
should be
都应该
respected.
得
All
到支
efforts,
持。
as long as they are conducive to
我
peaceful
们一
settlement
直
of the
同冲突
crisis,
当事
deserve
方、
our
其他
support.
有关各方
We have
和广大
maintained
发展中
close
国家保持密
communications
切
with
沟
the
通，
parties to the conflict, other
采取
interest
切
parties,
实
and the
措施，
developing
积
countries
极
in
劝
general,
和促
and have
谈，
taken practical
缓解人
measures
道
to
危机，
actively
管
promote
控
peace
外溢
talks,
影响。
alleviate humanitarian crisis,
今
and
年2
control
月，
spillover
中方发
effects.
布了关
In
于政治解
February
决
of
乌
this
克
year,
兰危机
China
的中
released
国立
its
场文
position
件，
paper on the
提出
political
尊重主
solution to the
权、
Ukrainian
停火止
crisis
战、
with
启
12
动和谈、
propositions,
停止
including
单边制
respect for
裁等
sovereignty,
12条主
ceasefire,
张。
and cessation of war, initiation of
中方
peace
将
talks,
继
and
续以此为
cessation
基础，
of
同国际
unilateral
社会一道，
sanctions,
为
among
推
others.
动乌克兰问
China
题
will
的
continue
政治解
to
决
use this as a
做
basis of
出
work with the
不懈努
international
力。
community to promote a political settlement of Ukrainian crisis. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, Mozambique wishes to commend the United Kingdom's presidency and Your Excellency Excellency, for taking the initiative of convening this meeting. We thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo for our insightful briefing. We welcome the participation in the debate of Their Excellency the Ministers and high dignitaries. Mr. President, as we gather today, the conflict in Ukraine continues unabated, with ever-mounting casualties and growing global ramifications. From the September 11, 2001 attacks to the rise of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and its incursion and spread into Africa, the past 20 years have had no shortage of history-changing conflicts with global implications. To this list of doom, we must now add the conflict in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is a 21st century tragedy. It is unfolding under our constant collective gaze and the scrutiny of the entire world. It is being fought both in the battlefield as well as in the court of a perplexed public opinion. The conflict has so far claimed thousands of lives, destruction of critical socioeconomic infrastructure, and causing global food shortages. It is heralding the return of nuclear brinkmanship. We are disappointed that so far all efforts to end the conflict, including with an African peace initiative, have been in vain. Mr. President, no other matter under the consideration of the Council in the last year and a half has commanded more attention and resources. It is Mozambique's considered view that the continuation of the armed confrontation in Ukraine is not the answer to the interests of the parties and neither of those of the world community at large. There is a danger that failure to solve this conflict, based on the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, could erode the trust in the notion of our collective security and our collective responsibility for international peace and security as set out in the Charter. A world thus divided will not be able to muster the resources and the political will needed to face countless other global challenges we are confronted with today. These challenges range from climate change to global terrorism, from global health threats to rising inequality. Mozambique has always called for the parties in conflict to take responsibility for protecting civilians. They must ensure compliance with the applicable international law and international humanitarian law. Furthermore, we consider that the parties must exhaust all avenues of dialogue, of a negotiated settlement of the conflict. In this context, Mozambique wishes to reiterate its call for an immediate ceasefire of hostilities. We advocate the return to direct negotiations between the parties as a matter of urgency and in full respect for the United Nations Charter. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. Now give floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President, and I also thank USG DiCarlo for her sobering and important briefing today. The international community has repeatedly called for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, based on full support for its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, including through UN General Assembly resolutions. Malta expresses its support for the key principles and objectives of Ukraine's peace formula, which also addresses the broader global ramifications of Russia's aggression on food security, energy security, nuclear safety, and the environment. International humanitarian law and human rights law must be upheld. Russia must immediately stop its illegal and indiscriminate shelling of civilians and civilian infrastructure. The human rights situation in the Russian-occupied territories also constitutes a matter of serious concern. As we just heard from USG DiCarlo, the numbers and statistics in the OHCHR report are harrowing and extremely disturbing. Furthermore, as explained in the findings of the UN International Commission of Inquiry, Russian armed forces have carried out attacks that may constitute war crimes. These include indiscriminate assaults on civilians and civilian infrastructure, execution, torture, unlawful imprisonment, inhumane detention, rape, and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence, and the unlawful deportation and transfer of children. Holding the perpetrators accountable for their actions and ensuring victims' right to reparation and justice are essential principles. We are fully supportive of ongoing ICC and ICJ processes. We also welcome the setting up of an international center for the prosecution of crime of aggression against Ukraine that will coordinate efforts to collect, preserve, and store evidence, as well as the establishment of the Council of Europe's Register of Damage caused by the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. President, less than 1 year into the establishment of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, more than 32 million tons of food commodities have been exported to 45 countries across 3 continents. It has proven itself a lifeline to millions, acting as a major defense against global food insecurity, accelerated by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Today, Malta is deeply concerned by the decision of the Russian Federation not to renew this initiative further. This is another example of the politicization of humanitarian needs, which we have already witnessed last week with the Syria file. It is of utmost importance that the Black Sea Grain Initiative is further extended and secured to alleviate pressures on food insecurity all over the globe. The weaponization of food is unacceptable. To conclude, Mr. President, by underlining the fact that the unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine continues to cause severe humanitarian and human rights violations, inflicting deep intergenerational trauma and exacerbating global crisis in food and energy supply. We once again urge the Russian Federation to immediately cease all hostilities and unconditionally completely withdraw all its forces and will military equipment from the entire territory in Ukraine. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Por convocar a esta reunión.
Thank you for convening this meeting.
Agradezco la exposición informativa de la Secretaria General Adjunta de Asuntos Políticos y Consolidación de la Paz, Rosemary DiCarlo. Desde el inicio del mandato del Ecuador en el Consejo de Seguridad en enero de 2023, hemos abordado la cuestión de la agresión militar contra Ucrania por lo menos una docena de veces. Esas sesiones a veces se enfocaron sobre el estado de la agresión y las perspectivas de paz. Otras sobre la protección de civiles. Otras sobre la protección de libertades, incluyendo de pensamiento y creencias religiosas. Otras se enfocaron en la transferencia de armas, en cuestiones como la situación de protección y seguridad nuclear en Zaporizhia o en la ruptura de la represa de Kakhovka. Algunas fueron agendadas por la presidencia.
Some of the meetings were placed on the agenda by the presidency, such as is the case today, or that on the 23rd of February this year. Other meetings were convened at the request of the United States and Albania, others on the request of Ukraine, others on the request of Russia, and others on the request of Ecuador and France, essentially on the humanitarian situation.
En estos 6 meses, hemos escuchado exponer ante este Consejo desde el Secretario General, Antonio Guterres, el coordinador de OCHA, la alta representante para asuntos de desarme, el director de la OIEA, hasta a ponentes de la academia o de la sociedad civil. El formato, el enfoque, el tema de agenda en el que han sido convocados
the
y
approach
sus
and the agenda
componentes
topic on which they
han
were
sido
convened and the
diferentes.
components of these meetings
El
differed.
Ecuador ha procurado en cada caso
In each case,
contribuir de
Ecuador
manera
sought
genuina
to make a
al tema
genuine
específico.
contribution to this specific
Pero hay un
topic.
elemento recurrente
But there
que
is
no ha
one
cambiado ni
recurrent
cambiará
element that hasn't changed and will
mientras
not
no cese
change
la violación de la
as long
Carta
as
de las
there is
Naciones
no end
Unidas
to the
y
violation
el
of the
derecho
United Nations
internacional.
Charter and of
Esto
international
es
law.
el llamado
That is the
prácticamente
practically
unánime de los
unanimous
miembros de este
call of
Consejo
members of this
de que se
Council
ponga fin a la
to
ocupación
bring
y
an
agresión
end
militar de
to
Rusia contra
the
Ucrania,
Russian occupation
tal
and
como lo
military
dispuso
aggression
la
against
Corte
Ukraine as
Internacional de
ordered by the
Justicia
International
el
Court of
16 de
Justice
marzo
on the
de
16th of
2022
March
y
2022,
se dé paso a
and
una solución
to make way
pacífica
for a
definitiva.
definitive peaceful solution.
Sobre esto, la Asamblea General también se pronunció de manera
Here, the
contundente
General Assembly has also
con
made
la
a strong
resolución sobre los
statement
principios
through
de
the
la Carta de la
resolution on
ONU,
the principles of the UN
subyacentes en
Charter,
una paz justa y
underlying a
duradera
just and
en
lasting
Ucrania.
peace in Ukraine.
El Consejo debe guiarse por esa decisión.
The Council should be
Hoy
guided by that decision.
deseo insistir en otros 4
Today, I'd
puntos.
like to stress 4 other points.
Primero, debemos pasar
First,
de la lógica de
We must
dominación de
move
un
from the
Estado
logic
sobre
of
otro
domination of
por
one
la
state
supremacía
over
militar,
another by military
por la lógica de
supremacy
la
to
diplomacia,
the logic of
para evitar un
diplomacy
conflicto más amplio
to
y
avoid
buscar la
a
paz
wider
definitiva.
conflict and to
Segundo,
seek definitive peace.
debemos reconocer el valioso aporte del
Second,
sistema de
we must
Naciones
recognize
Unidas
the valuable
y sus socios en
contribution
el
of the
terreno,
United Nations
ya sea
system
OCHA,
and its partners
ACNUR,
on the ground,
la
including
OIEA,
OCHA,
por mencionar
UNHCR,
unos pocos.
the IAEA, just
Tercero,
to cite a few.
insistimos en la necesidad
Third,
de que
we
las partes
insist on the
respeten
need for the parties
irrestrictamente
to
sus obligaciones
unreservedly
que derivan del derecho
respect
internacional
their
humanitario,
obligations under
lo que
international
implica no
humanitarian
atacar
law.
al personal de
This
asistencia humanitaria
implies refraining
y su
from
material.
attacking humanitarian aid
Urgimos a la
workers and their
Federación de
equipment.
Rusia
We urge the
que
Russian
permita el
Federation
acceso
to
humanitario
allow
en las zonas
humanitarian
provisionalmente bajo su
access to the
ocupación.
areas temporarily under its
Alentamos al
occupation.
intercambio seguro
We
de
encourage
prisioneros.
the safe exchange of
Deploramos las
prisoners.
violaciones
We
de los derechos de
deplore
los niños
violations of the
y
rights
que la
of
invasión
children and the
prolongada
fact
siga
that the protracted
cobrando
invasion
vidas.
continues to claim their
Y
lives.
cuarto, expresamos nuestra
Four,
mayor decepción
we express
por
our
el
utmost
anuncio de la
disappointment at
Federación
the
Rusa
announcement by
de
the Russian
retirarse de la
Federation
iniciativa
to
del grano del Mar
withdraw
Negro
from the Black
a
Sea
solo
Grain
5 días de
Initiative,
cumplirse
just
un año
5
del acuerdo,
days short of a year
con
into the
32
agreement.
millones de toneladas métricas
With
de
32
alimentos
metric tons
desde los
of
puertos de
food
Ucrania,
shipped from
la
Ukrainian
iniciativa
ports,
era
the
vital para
initiative was
millones de
vital for
personas,
millions of people,
incluyendo en
including in
Afganistán,
Afghanistan,
Yemen y el
Yemen,
Cuerno de
and the
África,
Horn of Africa.
y evitar así un deterioro
And
todavía
it
mayor
prevented an
de
even
la
greater
seguridad alimentaria en
deterioration
el mundo.
in the world food security.
Con más razón, la agresión militar de Rusia sobre Ucrania
All the more
no debe
reason
durar
why
un día
Russia's
más,
military aggression on
por estar
Ukraine
al
should not
margen de la
last one
legalidad
more day, because it's
internacional y
outside the
por las
bounds of international
consecuencias que
law,
tienen
because it's
sobre
having
Ucrania,
consequences on
sobre la
Ukraine,
propia
on
Rusia
Russia
y por
itself,
su impacto
and
global.
because of its global
Muchas gracias.
impact. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, dear colleagues, I thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. Brazil deeply regrets the continuing loss of human life, especially innocent civilians. We extend our solidarity to the families of the victims and to the millions of Ukrainian nationals who find themselves as refugees or internally displaced. Once again, we join our voice to the voices of other members in condemning the attacks against residential areas and the destruction of civilian infrastructure, especially hospitals and schools. We remind that parties in conflict have clear obligations under international law and international humanitarian law. We believe, however, that just the condemnation of illegal actions in the course of this war in itself will not bring us closer to peace. We urge both sides to de-escalate the fighting and initiate discussions on parameters for a comprehensive peace agreement, taking into account Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as the legitimate security concerns of all parties in line with principles of the UN Charter. We encourage the parties to seek a peaceful solution to the conflict in accordance with Article 33 of the Charter. This is the core of the many proposals for facilitating dialogue coming from different corners, such as the Peace Initiative of African leaders last month. Massive transfers of highly lethal weapons to the battlefront can further undermine prospects for a peaceful outcome. The increasing flow of weapons into the conflict in Ukraine will only fuel more violence and will not contribute to ending it. The presence of arms and ammunition in large quantities tends to become a destabilizing factor in the long term, compromising the chances of a lasting peace in the region and fueling conflict everywhere. Brazil renews its appeal to the parties to give first priority to the well-being of civilian populations on both sides of the front lines. Mr. President, the conflict in Ukraine affects us all, including in regions far from the combat zone. Developing countries are particularly vulnerable to the side effects of the war on their economy and their food and energy security. The Black Sea Grain Initiative has made an important contribution to stabilizing international food and fertilizer prices. In recent months, full implementation of the Istanbul agreements has become increasingly difficult, compromising the regularity of trade in agricultural products and inputs through ports in the Black Sea. In the absence of an agreement for a comprehensive and lasting peace, we urge the parties involved to spare no efforts to renew what USG DiCarlo described in one of our previous meetings as a beacon of hope. We welcome the efforts of the Secretary General in the constant search for a compromise between the parties in order to ensure food security and adequate nutrition for millions of people, especially in the least developed countries. This will keep up the hope that, in some way, this conflict will end. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President.
Je tiens tout d'abord à remercier le Royaume-Uni d'avoir accordé une attention particulière à la situation en Ukraine. Je remercie également la secrétaire générale adjointe, Rosemary DiCarlo, de son exposé, sombre soit-il. Et je salue la participation du ministre des Affaires étrangères d'Ukraine, son Excellence Kuleba. Le mois dernier, la deuxième édition de la conférence sur la reconstruction de l'Ukraine s'est déroulée à Londres. En juillet 2022, la Suisse en avait accueilli la première. Tant à Lugano qu'à Londres, la communauté internationale a fait preuve d'une forte détermination pour soutenir l'Ukraine dans son processus de reconstruction. Cette perspective d'une reconstruction d'un futur est essentiel, car dans le sillage de cette agression militaire russe, nous trouvons des milliers de personnes tuées, une infrastructure ukrainienne dévastée, une sécurité alimentaire mondiale ébranlée et des certitudes brisées. Permettez-moi d'élaborer. Premièrement, nous venons de l'entendre de la secrétaire générale adjointe, les pertes en vie humaine en Ukraine sont immenses. La semaine dernière encore, des civils ont perdu la vie dans la région de Zaporizhzhia alors qu'ils recevaient de l'aide humanitaire. À cela s'ajoute la destruction de l'infrastructure ukrainienne dont la reconstruction est une tâche herculéenne. Il est inacceptable que ce bilan continue à s'alourdir. Nous réitérons notre appel à la Russie à entamer immédiatement une désescalade, à cesser toutes les opérations de combat et à retirer sans délai ses troupes du territoire ukrainien. Nous rappelons que le droit international humanitaire protège la population et les infrastructures civiles. Elles ne doivent jamais devenir des cibles. Dans ce contexte, je tiens à exprimer la grave préoccupation de la Suisse concernant l'utilisation de mines antipersonnelles et d'armes à sous-munitions en Ukraine. Comme État partie des conventions d'Ottawa et d'Oslo, la Suisse appelle tous les États et parties au conflit à ne pas faire usage de ces armes. Les usages indiscriminés ou disproportionnés constituent une grave violation du droit international humanitaire. Deuxièmement, le rétablissement de la sécurité alimentaire mondiale est une tâche urgente. Depuis le début de l'agression militaire russe, des millions de personnes partout dans le monde sont tombées dans l'insécurité alimentaire. Les accords d'Istanbul font la différence pour ces personnes. Nous déplorons l'annonce faite par la Russie concernant les accords et espérons que ceux-ci seront reconduits dans un très proche avenir. Et finalement, nous avons vu ressurgir un spectre que nous pensions avoir banni, la guerre d'agression à but d'extension territoriale par un État souverain contre un autre État souverain. Et voilà les certitudes brisées. Face à ces multiples défis, nous devons nous appuyer sur un fondement solide. Et nous l'avons, ce fondement. Il s'agit de la Charte des Nations Unies. On aurait pu penser qu'une violation flagrante de la Charte nuise à son pouvoir. Au contraire, nous observons que la grande majorité des États réaffirment son importance. Plus de 140 États ont déploré l'agression contre l'Ukraine. En effet, les principes de la Charte et la résolution adoptée par l'Assemblée générale en février 2023 constituent la base sur laquelle une paix globale, juste et durable peut être construite en Ukraine. La Suisse suit attentivement les différents engagements visant à avancer vers la paix, tout en soulignant que la souveraineté et intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine doivent être respectées. Monsieur le Président, il est urgent de reconstruire l'Ukraine, mais pas suffisant. Il faut aussi rendre justice aux victimes. Il est également urgent de rétablir la sécurité alimentaire mondiale. La faim ne doit plus jamais devenir une arme de guerre. Nous devons donc continuer à resserrer les rangs derrière le droit international et notamment la Charte des Nations Unies, le bouclier qui nous protège toutes et tous pour que des bâtiments, les chaînes d'approvisionnement, la paix et la stabilité que nous finirons par reconstruire
we will eventually rebuild are based on a solid and lasting foundation for our humanity. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Insofar as today, in this hall, in addition to you, there are many other senior accomplices of the Kiev terrorist regime present who bear full responsibility for its crimes. I wish to first and foremost touch upon where your actions have led us to today in the context of the Ukrainian crisis. Before our very eyes, the tragedy is being worsened, the root cause of which was what was provoked by the United States and their Western allies. In the best colonial traditions, the anti-constitutional coup in Kiev in 2014. People who, since then, led the Kiev regime were guided certainly not by interests of Ukraine. Contrary to the aspirations of the majority of the Ukrainian people and for the advancement of Western fixations on confrontation with our country, they abandoned peace and good neighborly relations with Russia, a non-discriminatory approach with all nationalities residing in Ukraine, and began by leaps and bounds to advance rabid nationalism and to whitewash Nazi war criminals, having unleashed 9 years ago a brutal war against Russian language-speaking residents of Donbass. The Kiev regime deliberately and in a targeted way brought the Ukrainian crisis to the point of military confrontation with Russia. Our country had to protect those eliminated by Kiev in the eyes of the so-called civilized Western world, the people, women, children, and the elderly, after Ukraine and its Western sponsors definitively refused to comply with the Minsk agreements, which were approved by the UN Security Council. And as we know perfectly well today, all of these years, this document was a mere smokescreen for Ukraine's preparation by Western states for war with the Russian Federation. For this reason, all of the incantations of our Western colleagues about the alleged unprovoked Russian aggression and the war of choice no longer persuade anybody. Those who are capable of objective analysis can see perfectly clearly that we had no choice, and the time bomb that was detonated on February 2022 was programmed by the West at the minimum in 2014 and actually even earlier than then.
Как известно, в апреле 2022 года, то есть спустя чуть более месяца после начала нашего СВО, Украина отвергла уже парафированный своими переговорщиками мирный план урегулирования кризиса, подразумевавший в том числе международные гарантии безопасности для этой страны. Произошло это, как мы все сегодня хорошо знаем, при прямом участии Великобритании, тогдашнее руководство которой убедило лидера киевского режима, что при поддержке Запада Украина сможет одержать победу над Россией. Тогда по-настоящему и началась горячая фаза опосредованной войны НАТО против России до последнего украинца. А Украина, по сути, превратилась в нанятую Вашингтоном, Лондоном и Брюсселем частную военную кампанию. А чтобы пути назад у украинской власти не было, после отвода российских войск от Киева в качестве жеста доброй воли на фоне парафирования в Стамбуле проекта мирной договоренности, была организована омерзительная, по сути, и топорная по исполнению провокация в пригороде Киева. Как считают многие эксперты, прямую роль в ее организации сыграли британские спецслужбы. Так ли это или нет, покажет объективное расследование, которое мы обязательно проведем. Но все мы помним, как британское председательство в Совете Безопасности в апреле прошлого года за счет нечистоплотных процедурных маневров не дало провести запрошенное нами внеочередное заседание СБ в связи с этой провокацией, поведя себя недостойным для председателя Совбеза и постоянного члена Совета образом. Таким образом, оно полностью выдало себя в качестве сообщника киевского режима. Провокация в Буче задала необходимую дымовую завесу, прикрываясь которой украинское руководство вместо мира решило выбрать путь на вооруженное противостояние с Россией. А западные страны вместо дипломатических усилий удвоили усилия по предоставлению Украине помощи и западного оружия. Ценой за это роковое для Украины решение стали сотни тысяч погибших и искалеченных молодых украинцев, которых и сегодня киевский режим бросает в мясорубку на Восточном и Южном фронте, тщетно пытаясь доказать западным кураторам способность Украины побеждать. За это время страна уже потеряла несколько армий и фактически лишилась своего собственного оружия. Уважаемые коллеги, пользуясь присутствием среди нас сегодня ряда западных министров, я бы хотел сделать особый акцент на ответственность ваших правительств за продолжающуюся трагедию населения Украины. Планомерно подталкивая эту страну к войне с Россией вместо выполнения Минских соглашений, вы руководствовались исключительно собственными геополитическими интересами по ослаблению России. Ради этой несбыточной цели вы потворствовали формированию в Киеве настоящей тоталитарной диктатуры, развязавшей войну против собственных русскоязычных жителей на востоке страны. 8 лет вы не замечали, как от украинских снарядов гибнут мирные женщины, дети и старики. А сегодня они гибнут уже от поставляемых вами дальнобойных снарядов и ракет, поскольку украинские до мирного Донецка и других городов уже не добивают. Да и в принципе уже почти закончились. А чтобы страдания мирных людей были еще больше, вы решили поставлять в ВСУ снаряды с объединенным ураном и кассетные боеприпасы, а также не замечать непрекращающиеся обстрелы Запорожской атомной электростанции со стороны Украины, разрушение ею Каховской гидроэлектростанции и откровенные теракты на территории России, отражающие террористическую сущность украинской власти. Сегодня, в частности, мы все узнали об очередном теракте киевского режима в отношении моста в Крым, находящегося в сотнях километров от зоны боевых действий. В результате погибли двое ни в чем не повинных мирных россиян.
Crimea, hundreds of kilometers from the area of hostilities. As a result, two innocent Russians died, and their 14-year-old daughter was gravely wounded. I have not heard any condemnation of this act of terrorism from any of the Western sponsors of the Kiev regime, and we still have to get to the bottom of the degree to which, in the preparation and conduct of this terrorist attack, there was complicity of Western, including British intelligence services. Far too much points to this. Colleagues, all the facts that I've mentioned point to the fact that there are no crimes that the West is unwilling to commit to preserve its hegemony in global affairs in order to, as was said by Mr. Borrell, for at any cost to preserve the idyllic garden for everybody else to continue to live in jungles. And there are no principles that you are unwilling to breach to achieve this. And I'm saying this for you to harbor no illusions that your
countries, including your governments, bear equal responsibility, if not more responsibility, than the Zelensky regime for what is happening in Ukraine. And despite your attempts to portray yourselves as the defender of the poor, unfortunate Ukraine, your actions give the lie to your claims, and the actions of the Kyiv regime, including regarding the persecution of followers of the canonical Orthodox Church, you attempt to not notice this, leave no doubt that even when the regime begins to grab people off the streets and summarily execute those dissenters, those who disagree with the destructive anti-popular policy of the current authorities, is something which you will easily turn a blind eye to. But we will dwell on this in detail during the 26th July meeting we requested. I wish to touch upon another two issues which have to do with the Ukrainian subject. Exactly 9 years ago, in the skies of Donbass, the MH17 Malaysian Airlines flight was down. This event directly impacted the crisis inside Ukraine, forcing the Donbass insurgents with the military initiative to stop, in expectation of the imminent, as it seemed then, condemnation of Ukraine for the terrorist act that occurred. As is known, since this disaster, the Russian Federation consistently advocated comprehensive, thorough, impartial, apolitical investigation into the reasons behind the disaster based on facts and incontrovertible evidence. Russia was at the source of the adoption by the Security Council of Resolution 2166, stipulating the need to conduct a full, thorough, and independent international investigation. However, this has still not been carried out. The circumstances behind what has happened have not been credibly highlighted. The situation carried out by the Netherlands and the criminal investigation by the Joint Investigative Team did not reflect the criteria set out in Resolution 2166. Their real goal was not to establish the truth, but rather to tailor the relevant evidentiary basis to reflect the narrative of Russia's participation in the tragedy. Essentially, the MH17 disaster was nothing other than a key element of a mendacious, unfounded anti-Russian campaign, which was subsequently supplemented by the poisonings of Skripal and Navalny, as well as the Bucha provocation, which I've already mentioned. As is known, the worse and more horrific the lie, the easier it is to believe it. And this is specifically the principle that our Western opponents give pride of place to in all these instances. On MH17, the Russian Federation provided the investigation with vast troves of information, which had tremendous significance to identify the true causes for the disaster. However, this material was taken into account neither by the investigation nor by the Hague District Court. They preferred dubious sources from social networks, photographs, and video material, which was evidently redacted. Not a single question was put to Ukraine, which refused to provide radar data and recorded conversations of on-ground flight tracking services, and was unable to explain where the Ukrainian dispatchers who could have shed light on this tragedy, where they disappeared to. In the time that has elapsed since the disaster, there was no due consideration of the question of Kyiv's responsibility for opening airspace over the area of hostilities where air defenses, including Buks, were deployed. There was a particular clarity could have been introduced with U.S. satellite data, which were made on the day of the disaster. However, the judge's request to disclose this data, or at least allow access with compliance with certain conditions, were categorically denied by Washington. Unfortunately, the approach embraced by the Netherlands and their cronies is showing the fact that there is a smokescreen, and in this connection, we cannot but sympathize with families and loved ones of the dead who are deliberately denied their right to truth. And not a single Western colleague mentioned this tragedy today. You don't need the facts or the truth about this, and your role in the practice of slandering the Russian Federation has already been carried out. And now, to conclude, I wish to touch upon another issue. Today, through Russian embassies in Ankara, Minsk, London, as well as the Consul General in Istanbul, we circulated official notes about a decision made by the Russian government to end the Black Sea Initiative as of 18 July 2023. Similarly, the UN Secretary General and head of OCHA were notified, and they are directly responsible for its implementation. I see no point in delving into the details of how the so-called Istanbul package of Antonio Guterres was actually being implemented. a key component of which is the Russia-UN memorandum. We've already done this repeatedly, including here at the Security Council chamber. Further, as we see now, empty promises, the Secretariat were continued to be carried out by the Secretariat. And however, against the backdrop of the stable export from Ukraine to countries with high-level income countries and middle-income countries of corn fodder and wheat fodder, 90% and 60% of all exports, respectively, least developed countries received only 3% of those goods. And the World Food Program humanitarian operations received even less of this, 2.2% of wheat. These facts are too unsavory and they speak to themselves, and so the Black Sea Initiative was, without much ado, simply reformatted from a humanitarian to a commercial one. Against this backdrop, there remain unresolved issues that Russian export economic operators continue to encounter. Having announced in March this year our consent for the extension of the Black Sea Initiative for 60 days on 18 July, we categorically stated that we will take a decision on further steps only after consideration of progress in addressing certain tasks which we spoke about repeatedly. I will not relist them. At the same time, we pay tribute to the Secretary General and his team for their efforts in attempting to persuade Western countries to comply with obligations before the Russian Federation from the Russia-UN memorandum. However, these were mere smoke and mirrors. However, there has been no progress here, and the Kiev regime continues to use the cover of the open maritime corridor to wage provocations and attacks against Russian civilians and military objects. Against this backdrop, a decision was taken for us to exit the deal. Turkish and Ukrainian sides, as well as the UN Secretariat. This means an end to guarantees of safe navigation, curtailment of a maritime humanitarian corridor, restoration of a regime of a temporary dangerous area in the Northwest Black Sea, and reformatting of the Joint Coordination Center. And in this way, without Russia's participation, the Black Sea Initiative ends its operations as of 18 July. The Russian Federation will stand ready to consider its resumption only when concrete results are achieved rather than promises and assurances from Western capitals. And now, apparently, is the time, clearly, to demonstrate the stated solidarity of Kiev's European allies, who can export Ukrainian food through land corridors. For our part, despite the existing obstacles, we will continue to assume our obligation to fulfill contractual obligations to provide Russian grain to all purchasers.
Thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Monsieur le Président, je salue votre participation à cette réunion, ainsi que la présence des hautes personnalités qui prennent part à nos échanges aujourd'hui. Je remercie la sous-secrétaire générale adjointe, Madame Rosemary DiCarlo, pour son exposé. La guerre en Ukraine devient au fil des mois la question la plus examinée au sein de ce Conseil.
Has over the months become the most discussed topic within this Council, be it the security, humanitarian or nuclear-related issues. Nonetheless,
les violences persistent
the violence
et cette guerre continue de défier la paix et la stabilité internationale et de contribuer à l'insécurité alimentaire dans plusieurs régions du monde. Les offensives et contre-offensives de part et d'autre laissent
counter-offensives on both sides raise the spectre of an escalation of violence, an increase in the loss of human lives and property, as well as an ever greater population displacement, thus making the prospects for negotiations for lasting peace ever more remote. The damage caused over these 17 months is immense and very alarming. The latest reports of the Secretary General mention hundreds of attacks on hospitals, schools and civilian infrastructure. The number of non-military victims, particularly children, continues to rise. The Security Council must endeavour to find a peaceful solution in accordance with the principles of the United Nations Charter. We call on those countries with any influence on the main players to act so that a real dialogue can be initiated with a view to eventually reaching a lasting peace agreement. In this respect, my country encourages the Secretary General to continue to use his good offices to promote the launch of talks between all parties. It is essential for the international community to support and coordinate the various diplomatic initiatives to promote a negotiated settlement.
President, today, the 17th of July 2023, the Black Sea Grain Initiative comes to an end. This is a vital agreement for numerous countries. We remain hopeful that it will be renewed so it can be continued as soon as possible. The constant threat posed by the risk of the nuclearization of this war is also a potential danger that must be avoided. My country reiterates its commitment to the NPT and opposes all politicization, intimidation and trivialization of the nuclear issue. Nuclear power plants are civilian infrastructure protected by international humanitarian law. They must not be used for military purposes. The humanitarian situation is taking on increasingly critical proportions, as we've heard. We reiterate the need for unimpeded humanitarian access for the most vulnerable people, often living in the areas with the highest security risks. President, to conclude, Gabon reiterates its call for de-escalation and good faith negotiations to bring an end to the conflict. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Dmytro Kuleba, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Excellencies, I thank the UK Presidency for convening this meeting. My gratitude also goes to Under-Secretary General Di Carlo for her briefing. Today marks 9 years since Russia shot down the civilian airliner MH17 over Ukraine, killing all 298 people on board. Ukraine mourns victims of this crime. The case of MH17 is also a prime example of Russian lies and abuse of its illegal presence at the United Nations Security Council. Instead of admitting guilt and cooperating with the investigation, Russia chose to promote conspiracy theories in order to confuse the public. In 2015, Russia shamelessly used its UN veto to prevent the establishment of a relevant international tribunal, despite its own denial of responsibility. The Dutch trial finally put an end to all the Russian nonsense. The court determined that MH17 was hit by a Russian Buk missile fired by armed groups controlled by Moscow, and that the system had been returned to Russia after the strike. The bottom line is that no amount of lies can change the truth and avert justice. In any situation, Russian strategy is kill, lie, and deny. Our strategy should be the opposite: strength, truth, and accountability. Today, we are facing two more situations of this kind. The first one was another set of lies and denials we have heard in this room. The second one is Russia killing the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Russia is blackmailing the world. This blackmail affects the lives of millions of Ukrainians and tens of millions more around the world, primarily in Africa and Asia, who face the threat of rising food prices and hunger. Ukraine makes no demands in relation to the deal. We simply wanted to continue operating and expand its capacity. We want our grain to be freely exported and reach foreign customers all around the globe. At the same time, Russia has been systemically obstructing the initiative's normal functioning. Russia deliberately decreased the number of inspections in the Joint Coordination Center in Istanbul, limiting the capacity to 1-2 vessels per day. On April 29th, Russia fully blocked the functioning of Ukraine's Pivdenny seaport. The last grain vessel departed the port of Odessa on July 16th. As of now, Russia has fully blocked the functioning of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, even without announcing its termination. Whatever Russia is saying to excuse its behavior, please note that while blocking our ports, Moscow is increasing exports of its own grain, including the ones stolen from temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Last year, when the initiative was introduced, grain prices around the world immediately dropped. Together with other factors, it had a positive long-term effect. In June 2023, they were 23% lower than in March 2022, when Russia started the illegal blockade of our seaports. The immediate outcome of Russia pulling out of the deal now will be that prices will go up again, hurting those most vulnerable, primarily in Asia and Africa. Russia must stop playing Hunger Games with the people around the world. I call on all UN member states to firmly demand that Russia resume its participation in the deal in good faith and stop its Hunger Games. Russia must keep politics out of global food security. I must also draw the attention of the Council to another threat that Russia poses. Since Russia occupied the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in March 2022, Ukraine and other neighboring nations have been living in fear of a nuclear incident. Russia has violated all 7 nuclear safety and security pillars of the International Atomic Energy Agency by stationing its military at the plant and turning it into a military base. Despite international pressure, Russia refuses to withdraw from the plant. Today, Russia remains in full control and bears full responsibility for the situation there. Russia is also spreading ridiculous conspiracy theories about Ukraine allegedly planning an attack on the plant. Whether it is the downing of MH17, the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, or any other major Russian crime, their strategy remains the same: kill, lie, and deny. I take this opportunity to say it again officially and unequivocally. Ukraine has never had and cannot have any intention of causing any incidents at our own nuclear power plants in our own country. The only force that has the capacity and the motives to cause any such incident is Russia. By acting together and calling out liars now, we can prevent them from executing their malicious plans. Distinguished colleagues, I want to believe that the era of Russian crimes, lies, and denials is coming to an end. Russia is losing its illegal war against Ukraine. Putin's regime is getting weaker by the day, and the latest Wagner mutiny has demonstrated it not only to the whole world, but also to the Russians themselves. Every defeat on the Russian battlefield brings Putin's regime closer to realizing the futility of aggression. We should all work together to bring this realization closer. For when the Kremlin's chief liar realizes no one believes his lies any longer, he will be forced to call a halt to the war. This Council has been unable to take concrete actions in accordance with Chapter 7 of the UN Charter for more than 500 days of Russia's full-scale invasion, as well as for more than 9 years of its aggression. And it applies not only to the case of Ukraine, but to other conflicts raging in the world. The root problem is well known, and its name can be found on the fourth plate to the right of the presidency. Despite the fact that this plate was placed on the table more than 3 decades ago, the UN Charter still says nothing about the legitimacy of its presence here. We firmly believe that the future reform of the UN Security Council needs to include an essential component: the decision to deprive Russia of its illegally obtained status as a permanent member and the veto right that comes with it. This Council and the entire world will become a much healthier place once Russia is out of here. While some international organizations are paralyzed by fear of poisonous Russian influence, it is a Ukrainian soldier who assumes responsibility for maintaining peace and security in the world today. A Ukrainian soldier restores peace and security with each step forward and each liberated settlement in Ukraine, basically putting into action what this Council is supposed to maintain and enforce. This comes at a steep cost, but there is no other choice. Please honor the sacrifice and keep assisting us in bringing peace closer. Ukrainians will always be grateful for your support, and our victory will also be your victory against the scourge of aggression in the world. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Kuleba for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Peter Szijjártó, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade of Hungary.
Well, dear Secretary, dear James, first of all, I'd like to express our appreciation that you give the chance to the neighboring countries to take the floor in this debate as well. I am representing a neighboring country of Ukraine, a country which has been living in the shadow of the war for the last more than 500 days, a war impacts and consequences of which are serious and direct on our country. The Hungarian people have been already paying a high price for this war, although bearing no responsibility for it. In the meantime, I am representing a nation, members of which are among the casualties of this war, given the fact that there's a significant Hungarian community living in Ukraine, around 150,000, members of which, as Ukrainian citizens, are being mobilized to the army in Ukraine, and a lot of them, unfortunately, have already died. And as a representative of a neighboring country and a nation, members of which are dying in this war, I'd like to continue to argue in favor of peace to be created as soon as possible, although I understand this is not falling totally in line with the mainstream positions, and we continue to do so even if we are being criticized and attacked for this position of ours. And as a neighboring country and as a representative of a nation, members of which are dying in this war, we still do believe that the solution is not on the battlefield, but around the negotiating table. And we hear very often that the circumstances and the conditions are not given to launch negotiations to find a diplomatic solution. But allow me to express a different opinion of ours. We do believe that the conditions to launch negotiations to reach a diplomatic solution are getting worse and worse day by day. The longer this war is going to take, the more weapons are occurring in our neighborhood, the more people will die, and the devastation and destruction in our neighborhood will be more and more severe. So we wish that the international community would bring more peace to our neighborhood than weapons. And we all know, Mr. President, that in case we cut the channels of communication, then we literally give up the hope for peace. Therefore, we really do appreciate and respect the efforts to make peace in our neighborhood and the missions which are launched with this target. We'd like to express our respect to the Holy See, to the President of Turkey, and to the African countries, which, although are located far away from the war, but they are confronted with the very serious challenges as an impact of the war as well. And I also would like to highlight the importance of the safe supply of food all around the world, especially in the fragile regions, where shortage of food can very easily cause serious security-related challenges, which for the first time might be local, but then they would spread around the world and become global as well. And they can end up in further migratory waves, which will further increase the global threat of terror. And we all see that we cannot cope with one security-related challenge, so how can we cope with more? This, Mr. President, unfortunately, if we take into consideration the last 80 years, it's not an exaggeration to say that the global security in its worst shape currently. There are open and shameless references to nuclear capacities. And the chance for the outbreak of the Third World War is more imminent than ever before. And we also see a regrettable long-term consequence that the world is making huge steps in order to be divided into blocs again. And we Central Europeans have very bad historic experiences in this regard, because no one would like to listen to that, and based on history that might be uncomfortable for many to listen to that. But whenever there was a conflict between East and West, we Central Europeans were always left alone, and we always lost on these occasions. So when we argue in favor of a civilized cooperation between East and West, for which we might have some small chance for the future, we do it because this is our national interest. And the longer this war takes, the chance will be much smaller for that. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Siarto for his statement, and I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Zbigniew Rau, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Poland.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I would like to thank the United Kingdom for convening this meeting, which is of even more importance in the light of the most recent developments concerning the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Russia's unilateral withdrawal from the deal generally means one thing. Russia decided to fan the flames of its imperial war against Ukraine with rekindled economic aggression against the most needy and vulnerable states and societies of the Global South. We call on the parties remaining in the initiative to hold to their commitments so essential to the global food market. Mr. President, the Ukrainian people have been fighting Russia's full-fledged aggression for over 500 days now. This blatant violation of the UN Charter by a Security Council permanent member has been the most overwhelming threat to the world peace and security since the Cold War, because of its far-reaching and long-lasting consequences. Let me point to three major concerns that this aggression causes for the whole international community. Firstly, the Russian invasion conclusively demonstrates the complex and interlocking nature of threats to international security. We clearly see that this war transcends the Ukrainian and Russian borders, and today's developments, I'm already mentioned, regarding the Black Sea Green Initiative are the most urgent and direct reminder. Neither can we forget about the constant undermining of the security of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which continues to carry enormous potential risks and unpredictable consequences to all of us. Also, the recent destruction of a dam in Novanakovka by Russia brought significant cost to the whole ecosystem of and around the Black Sea and to all its coastal states. Moreover, we have addressed the consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in our debates on children in armed conflicts, sexual violence in conflicts, cybersecurity, or destruction of natural heritage. All these aspects require constant attention and determination of the Security Council as the institution responsible for world peace and security. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, secondly, the international law-abiding community cannot tolerate impunity. The perpetrators of international crimes must be held accountable. Each and every aggressor must reckon with legal consequences. Otherwise, they will feel encouraged to continue on the same path. We view accountability as a prerequisite to ensuring a lasting peace in the future. Poland supports the existing institutions such as the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and the European Court of Human Rights. We are also engaged practically in the creation of a special tribunal for the crime of Russian aggression. We are glad that a recent meeting of the proposed tribunal's core group took place in Poland. We equally support efforts to establish an international mechanism for reparations for damage caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We also join the enlarged partial agreement on the register of damage caused by the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine that was adopted at the recent Council of Europe summit in Reykjavik. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, finally, let us remember that in every effort to find peace in Ukraine, we must propose only rightful solutions, as an unjust peace or a frozen conflict would only prolong instability and would attract further aggression. The only sustainable peace solution must be based on the UN Charter and its fundamental principle of territorial integrity. Thus, the international community must remain steadfast in defending the UN Charter. We must continue to put pressure on the aggressor and support the victim in exercising the right of self-defense. The world must keep supporting Ukraine, which is a just cause. We strongly appeal to the UN Security Council members and to the entire UN family to show determination in defending the fundamental principles of the international order. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Rau for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Annalena Baerbock, Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President, Under Secretary General. Mom, come and get me. These were the words Natalia Shonki had been desperately waiting for. Weeks earlier, Russian troops had arrived at a school in Kupiansk, near Kharkiv in Ukraine. The school Natalia's 15-year-old son, Artem, went to every day like a normal schoolboy. They took Artem and a dozen of his schoolmates away. Natalia told reporters that for weeks she had no idea where he was. She did not know if he was still alive. Then at last, Artem was able to contact her. Mom, come and get me. That's what he told his mother on the phone. It took Natalia months to find her son, to get him back. She managed to travel to the place in Russian-occupied Ukraine where he was being held and took him home, finally, back into her arms. Artem's and Natalia's story is one of many. Since the start of Russia's war of aggression, Russian authorities have transferred and deported thousands of Ukrainian children to Russian-occupied territory and to Russia itself. Those who have been able to return, like Artem, describe shocking experience. How they were first to speak Russian and to sing the Russian national anthem in Russian children's homes. How their names and ages were changed in order to erase their identity, in order that their parents will never find them again. How they were threatened with being adopted by Russian families. Since I've learned about these crimes, I cannot stop imagining how I would feel if these children
by my own 2 little daughters. I know that colleagues from Africa, Asia, Latin America feel the same. During the recent visit to Ukraine and Russia by a delegation of African heads of state and government, they made it very clear that with regard to these children, humanity must come first. So let us work on this issue, especially as I'm aware that we are not on all the same page about every aspect of this war here in this room. But humanity is what unites us. All of us have experienced the tragedy of war in our regions. But when an aggressor does not even stop at children, tragedy turns into horrendous inhumanity. Recognizing this, the African colleagues proposed the return of the deported children as a first confidence-building measure. And I want to wholeheartedly echo their proposal. I would like to invite all of you to join forces with international organizations, Ukrainian authorities and NGOs to investigate Russia's deportations and together find ways to bring these children back home. Despite all our differences, one conviction should be beyond debate. The deported children belong with their parents. They need to be returned home, home to Ukraine, now. To Russia, I would like to say, you can fool yourself, but you cannot fool the world. The world, within the last 500 days, has been to Bucha, to Irpin, to Kharkiv. The world has seen Russian atrocities. The world has spoken to the mothers like Natalia, whose children your government has taken. The horror of the deported Ukrainian children is a tip of the iceberg of the unspeakable suffering that Russia's war has brought to so many children around the world. By bombing roads, blocking ports, and laying mines in grain fields in Ukraine, Russia has been adding fuel to the fire of a global food crisis. As a result, families on every continent struggle to make ends meet, and children go to bed hungry every night. And now, with announcement that it will withdraw from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, Moscow is threatening even more people, more children, with starvation. By helping to bring down global food prices, this initiative has been a lifeline for the weakest and most vulnerable around the world. As the Secretary General has pointed out this morning, after Russia's pulling out, we immediately saw wheat prices jump. Colleague, it's about humanity. It's about us. I therefore call like us on Russia to stop using hunger as a weapon. Stop abducting children. Stop your illegal war on Ukraine in the name of humanity. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Baerbock for her statements. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Jean Asselborn, Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of Luxembourg.
Monsieur le Président, merci beaucoup. Je remercie votre pays, le Royaume-Uni, d'avoir organisé dans le cadre de sa présidence cette réunion ministérielle sur les conséquences de la guerre en Ukraine et les perspectives d'une paix juste et durable. Je salue la participation de mon collègue et ami ukrainien Dmytro Kuleba. J'ai l'honneur de parler au nom des pays du Benelux, c'est-à-dire la Belgique, le Royaume des Pays-Bas et mon propre pays, le Luxembourg. Nous souscrivons à l'intervention qui sera faite par l'Union européenne. Il y a 9 ans, jour pour jour, le 17 juillet 2014, le vol MH17 de Malaysia Airlines a été abattu par un missile russe tiré depuis un champ agricole dans l'est de l'Ukraine, un territoire qui était à l'époque sous le contrôle effectif de la Fédération de Russie. 298 personnes de 17 nationalités différentes ont perdu la vie, dont des Néerlandais, des Belges et une famille qui vivait au Luxembourg. Nous réitérons l'exigence formulée dans la résolution 2166 du Conseil de sécurité que l'on contraigne les responsables de cet incident à répondre de leurs actes et que tous les États s'associent pleinement aux efforts déployés pour établir les responsabilités. Nous dénonçons la désinformation que la Russie a de nouveau propagée lors de cette réunion. Monsieur le Président, nous sommes profondément choqués par l'impact dévastateur de l'agression non provoquée et injustifiée menée par la Russie contre l'Ukraine. Un nombre croissant de témoignages et de rapports décrivent des attaques d'une brutalité insupportable perpétrées par les forces armées russes contre des civils et des infrastructures civiles, y compris des écoles et des hôpitaux. Les sièges des villes en Ukraine, la traite des êtres humains, les viols et d'autres formes de violences sexuelles visant en particulier des femmes et des enfants. Nous rappelons la nécessité de mettre en œuvre les résolutions du Conseil de sécurité sur la protection des infrastructures civiles et notamment la résolution 2601 appelant à prendre des mesures pour protéger les écoles contre les attaques. Pour la première fois, les forces armées et groupes armés affiliés de la Russie, un membre permanent du Conseil de sécurité, ont été listés dans le rapport annuel du secrétaire général sur les enfants et les conflits armés et sur le terrain des attaques indiscriminées continuent. L'agression de la Russie vise à détruire l'économie de l'Ukraine. Elle a également un impact sur la sécurité alimentaire dans le monde entier. Dans ce contexte, nous saluons fortement l'initiative de la mer Noire promue par le secrétaire général des Nations Unies. Nous appelons à sa pleine mise en œuvre et son prolongement sur le long terme et déplorons vivement la décision de la Russie de suspendre sa participation. Monsieur le Président, la responsabilité pénale est essentielle pour garantir et maintenir la paix et la sécurité internationale. La paix et la justice vont de pair et se renforcent mutuellement. La lutte contre l'impunité pour les atrocités commises en Ukraine est également importante pour décourager la commission de crimes à l'avenir en Ukraine et dans d'autres pays. Je tiens également à réaffirmer notre attachement aux travaux sur la redevabilité pour les crimes d'agression. Nous nous félicitons de la création du Centre international chargé des poursuites pour le crime d'agression contre l'Ukraine, qui vient de commencer ses activités à La Haye. Nous appuyons pleinement les efforts déployés pour mettre en place un tribunal chargé des poursuites pour le crime d'agression. Enfin, nous soutenons le registre des dommages pour l'Ukraine établi par le Conseil de l'Europe. Permettez-moi aussi de répondre juste en une phrase à mon collègue de la Hongrie. La Hongrie n'est pas critiquée pour s'investir pour une solution de paix, mais pour ses positions qui visent souvent à affaiblir la solidarité en matière de sanctions visant à limiter au moins les moyens financiers pour continuer cette guerre. Monsieur le Président, les pays du Benelux soutiennent la formule de paix présentée par le président Zelensky. Il s'agit d'un plan de paix crédible, compatible avec la Charte des Nations Unies, ainsi qu'avec les aspirations des Ukrainiens. L'adoption le 23 février dernier à la large majorité de 141 voix de la résolution de l'Assemblée générale sur les principes de la Charte des Nations Unies, sous-entendant une paix globale, juste et durable en Ukraine, a démontré l'appui de la communauté internationale à cette formule de paix. Nous soutenons les efforts en vue de parvenir à une paix conforme à la Charte des Nations Unies qui respecte la souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine à l'intérieur de ses frontières internationalement reconnues. Enfin, je voudrais conclure en réaffirmant la solidarité pleine et entière des pays du Benelux avec le gouvernement et le peuple ukrainien. Avec nos partenaires européens, nous continuerons à soutenir l'Ukraine sur la base des valeurs et le respect de la dignité humaine, de liberté, de démocratie, d'égalité de l'état de droit
democracy,
ainsi
equality,
que de
rule
respect des
of
droits de
law,
l'homme
as well as
que nous
respect for
partageons.
human
Je vous
rights, which
remercie.
we share. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Asselborn for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Carolina Edstadler, Federal Minister for the European Union and Constitution at the Federal Chancellery of Austria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, more than 500 days have passed since Russia launched an unprovoked and unjustifiable war of aggression against its neighbor, Ukraine. This blatant violation of the UN Charter and ongoing aggression and occupation of Ukrainian territory by a permanent member of this Council must not go unaddressed. As members of the international community, we cannot stand idly by while the fundamental principles of our shared legal and security order are under threat. An attack against one member of this organization is an attack against all of us. This is what the UN Charter and our system of collective security imply. In recent decades, significant progress has been made in advancing international law and building guardrails aimed at safeguarding the rule of law. However, faced with such flagrant breach of the Charter, we have no choice but to reiterate that respect for international law is not an option, it is an obligation. We must not accept living in a world where the law of the powerful overrides the rule of law. It is our collective responsibility to work towards a future where might does not make right. Blatant violations of international law must be met with resolute consequences by the international community. The United Nations was created out of the ashes of World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust to, and I quote, save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, end of quote, as the Charter states. Yet, the silence of this Council, the most powerful body within this organization, in the face of the Russian aggression, is a fundamental concern. Excellencies, we should never get used to the reality of the war in Ukraine. Indeed, we should never get accustomed to any war around the world. We urgently need a global system capable of responding to these threats, a Security Council that is effective, a Security Council that is representative, reflective of today's world and equipped to tackle the challenges of the 21st century. This war has already led to terrible consequences for the civilian population of Ukraine. Thousands of civilian lives have been lost. Nearly 1/3 of Ukrainians were forced to flee their homes. I have witnessed it myself, the destruction and horrors of this war during my visit to Ukraine last November. I myself had to take shelter from the missiles falling on Kiev. And I saw destroyed residential buildings where so many people lost their lives. Austria vehemently condemns the deliberate attacks on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. The humanitarian consequences, such as the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, cannot be overstated. Many of these acts constitute war crimes, and some, as the UN Commission of Inquiry has found, may even amount to crimes against humanity. Recognizing that impunity fuels the cycle of atrocities, the perpetrators must and they will be held accountable. In this regard, my country fully supports all efforts to do so, including by the International Criminal Court. The repercussions of this war extend far beyond Ukraine. They are felt all around the globe. And let me be clear, the impact on food and energy prices around the world are a direct consequence of the Russian aggression. We welcome the leadership of the Secretary-General and President Erdogan of Turkey in facilitating the Black Sea Initiative, which reminds us that diplomacy and pragmatism have an important role to play even in these challenging times. We urge Russia to reconsider its decision announced today and to enable the continuation of the Black Sea Initiative. Excellencies, the repeated implicit but unmistakable nuclear threats are unacceptable. The nuclear risks are higher today than they have been in decades, even higher than at the peak of the Cold War. Nuclear weapons hold the potential for catastrophic humanitarian and environmental consequences. This underscores the urgent need for progress in nuclear disarmament and a departure from the nuclear deterrence paradigm. The international community must ensure that the taboo against any use of nuclear weapons is safeguarded and that any threat or use remains inadmissible. It is essential that the International Atomic Energy Agency secures nuclear energy facilities that have been targeted in this war. We appreciate Director General Grossi's proposal in this regard and express gratitude for the dedicated work of the teams on the ground. Excellencies, this war of aggression must end. I call upon the Russian Federation to immediately and without any condition withdraw its forces from all of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. And I call on us, let us not grow numb to the horrible consequences of the war, to the suffering of civilians, to the constant threat of nuclear catastrophe, to the economic repercussions felt around the globe. Instead, let us use our collective strength to bring an end to this war and secure a just and lasting peace for Ukraine based on the UN Charter and international law. I thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Edstadler for her statements. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Giedrė Balčytytė, Chancellor of the Government of Lithuania. You have the floor.
Mr. President, please let me start with a word of appreciation to the United Kingdom Presidency for granting our request to deliver the statement on behalf of Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and my own country, Lithuania. I also would like to thank USG DiCarlo for the briefing and the continued engagement of the UN in documenting and reporting crimes committed during Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, spanning now for over or almost a year and a half, as well as for substantial efforts to alleviate global consequences of this brutal war of aggression. Mr. Chairman, as some of the chairs already stated, this war of aggression started well before a year and a half. On this date, 9 years ago, as we all know, Russia shut down Malaysia Airlines flight MH17, killing 283 passengers and 15 crew members on board. And we support all efforts to hold Russia and all those responsible accountable for this brutal crime. Though we acknowledge efforts of our global partners in reaching peace in Ukraine, however, Russia cynically continues this unprovoked full-scale war and shows no signs of ending it. Russia manipulates internationally agreed rules, facts, and violates UN Charter and other international agreements, abusing international structures, weaponizing disinformation, and using brutal force. And all this sets precedent for the future. If Russia's actions will be ignored and legitimized this time, future of many countries in the world, those that build peace, prosperity, and sovereignty thanks to the rules-based order, becomes at risk. So we believe that for ensuring comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, certain prerequisites are essential, and I will focus on some of them today. First, Ukrainian peace formula is the guideline we should follow in seeking just and sustainable peace. It gathered strong support in the UN General Assembly, and any attempts to adopt or simplify it would risk at washing out its essence and pandering to Russia's manipulation. Ukraine must have the final say on peace on its own soil. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, as countries bordering Russia, will continue our firm stance against appeals to yield to Russia's demands. We all have witnessed Russia's blackmail in relation to the Black Sea Initiative and based on manipulation of facts regarding its grain and fertilizer exports. If Russia would be prioritizing global food security as it claims, it would have stopped inventing obstacles to the work of Joint Coordination Center and continuation of the initiative itself. So we strongly condemn Russia for unilaterally abandoning the Black Sea Grain Initiative and choosing to further aggravate the global food security crisis. Second, a just and lasting peace must be in line with the principles of UN Charter, in particular sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. Russia must stop war and immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw its troops and equipment from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders and its territorial waters. As the UN community, we must ensure the protection of the core principles of our cooperation and condemn all those who are actively facilitating Russia's war. Belarus, that participates in this war by providing military equipment, training, and allows its territory to be used for the offensive. Iran, that supports Russia with military equipment, undermining global sanctions. Both must end their assistance to Russia's aggression and return to compliance with international law. Belarus, actually, becoming home for Russian nuclear weapons, as well as elements of Wagner criminal, in Lithuania's position terrorist group, responsible for brutal human rights violations, in addition to Ukraine, also in Mali, CAR, and elsewhere in Africa, where they operate under disguise of so-called security providers. Third, it is essential to recognize that Russia bears sole responsibility for inflicting immense suffering upon the Ukrainian population. The International Criminal Court has issued the arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin in relation to the forced deportation of the Ukrainian children. And this is only the first step to bring perpetrators to justice. Russia must be held accountable also for numerous war crimes, including deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure and causing environmental disasters. There should be no hesitation in attributing these crimes. Regarding the crime of aggression, we all need to seek for the establishment of special international tribunal following Ukraine's lead. Mr. President, together we possess capability and determination to assist Ukraine in reconstruction of its schools, hospitals, and roads, and we have already started it without any delay. However, it will take decades for Ukraine and its people to recover from suffering that this war inflicted. No doubt Ukraine has inherent right of self-defense against the Russian aggression, and we underline the decisions of the EU and NATO leaders offering robust financial, economic, humanitarian, military, and diplomatic support to Ukraine and its people for as long as it takes. We also welcome the decision regarding strengthening of NATO's eastern flank capabilities adopted in the meeting of the North Atlantic Council in Vilnius last week. So let me reaffirm Estonia's, Latvia's, and Lithuania's strong condemnation of Russia's war against Ukraine and express our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Aggression as an instrument in international relations must be condemned and completely eliminated. Those responsible for Russia's war and use of military force against Ukraine must be brought to justice. We must unite our efforts in pursuit of supremacy of international law. I thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Balchitite for her statement, and now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Lotte Macon, Deputy Minister for Development Cooperation of Denmark.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 5 Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. The Nordic countries would like to express our grave concern over the grim humanitarian consequences of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, as well as the war's devastating global implication in areas already affected by humanitarian crisis and food insecurity, such as the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, Yemen, and beyond. All areas demand our immediate attention and concerted efforts. Today, the Nordics would like to share 3 messages on, firstly, the grave humanitarian situation in Ukraine, secondly, the global implications of Russia's aggression and the importance of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and thirdly, our support to all meaningful initiatives towards a just peace. On 9th July, several civilian casualties were recorded in yet another Russian attack at a humanitarian aid distribution site in the frontline zone of Orikhiv. Not far from there, Russia's illegal military seizure of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant continues to pose devastating and widespread risks in an area already severely affected by the destruction of the Kafkara Dam. Mr. President, We strongly condemn Russia's indiscriminate warfare and intentional attacks on civilians, as well as Iran's provision of drones to Russia in violation of Security Council Resolution 2231 of 2015. All those responsible must be held accountable for violations of international humanitarian law and violations and abuses of human rights against Ukraine's civilian population, including the forcible transfer and deportation of children and conflict-related sexual violence. We also call on Russia to ensure full, safe, and unhindered access for humanitarian actors to all areas under its temporary military control, as well as to persons detained by Russia or forcibly transferred by Russia, including children. Secondly, we are concerned with the future of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. The initiative has helped avoid a further deterioration of the global food crisis amplified by Russia's war of Ukraine. We welcome the active engagement by the Secretary General and Turkey in facilitating the initiative. Since the launch of the initiative, which has safely exported over 32 million tons of grain and foodstuff, we've seen a lowering of global food prices. 56% of the export have gone directly to developing countries. In May, export drops, however, to the lowest volume since the initiative began, largely due to the Russian obstruction in the inspection and registration of shipping vessels. Let us not forget that the Black Sea Grain Initiative would not have been needed had it not been for the Russian aggression, and Russia obviously bears a heavy responsibility for ensuring its continuation and smooth operation. And thus we deeply deplore today's news that Russia has suspended the initiative and urge Russia to ensure a long-term rollover and full implementation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative in line with the Istanbul Agreement, and to urgently lift all impediments that delay operations of the initiative. Mr. President, the Nordics support all meaningful efforts to bring an end to Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Such effort must include Russia's complete and unconditional withdrawal of its military forces from the entire territory of Ukraine and respect for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. We stand ready to support Ukraine's initiative for a just peace and all initiatives seeking to advance peace in line with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant General Assembly resolutions. And we welcome the G7 Joint Declaration of Support for Ukraine and the intent to build on that framework to ensure Ukraine's long-term security. In closing, the Nordics reaffirm our commitment to the UN founding principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the peaceful settlement of disputes, to the security and well-being of the people in Ukraine and everywhere. Our resolve is unwavering for as long as it takes. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Macron for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Olof Skog, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states and the candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, potential candidate country Georgia, the EFTA country Liechtenstein, as well as Andorra, Monaco and San Marino all align themselves with this brief statement. I want to thank the Presidency of the Council for the opportunity to say a few words to the Council, and thanks Under-Secretary General De Carlo for your briefing, and through you the UN system for its continued support to the people of Ukraine under very difficult circumstances, and of course pay tribute and acknowledge the presence of Minister Kuleba here this afternoon. President, we want to reiterate our resolute condemnation of Russia's war on aggression, which constitutes a manifest violation of the UN Charter and international law. We also condemn the continued military support for Russia's war of aggression provided by Iran and Belarus. The EU is unwavering in our support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity within its international recognized borders, as well as its inherent right of self-defense. Allow me to emphasize 3 points in my intervention: the need for a comprehensive, just and lasting peace, the importance of addressing the global consequences of Russia's aggression, and the need to hold Russia and its leadership to account. People of Ukraine, the international community, and almost all members of the Council have repeatedly expressed desire for a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with the UN Charter, the resolutions of the General Assembly, and international law. We welcome all international efforts to this effect, including the recent visit by African leaders. The EU will sustain support to Ukraine and will continue our work to ensure the widest possible international support for the key principles and objectives of Ukraine's peace formula. I underline that with what so many others have said this afternoon, that any initiative for sustainable peace in Ukraine must be based on full respect for its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. On the global consequences, we condemn Russia's decision to unilaterally terminate the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We thank the UN and the Secretary General and all involved for their efforts in attempting to reach an agreement. The initiative's suspension creates widespread uncertainty on global markets and exacerbates the dire situation of food importing countries, hurting the poorest and the most vulnerable the most. Russia continues to weaponize food and undermine global food security. At a time when 258 million people face hunger, this is deeply irresponsible. While continuing to commit its flagrant violation of the UN Charter, Russia now, piece by piece, undermines the multilateral system, blocking Security Council action for humanitarian assistance to Syria, and now preventing the extension under UN auspices of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Since its signing in Istanbul last year, the initiative has eased pressure on global food prices by facilitating the export of more than 32 million metric tons of foodstuff. Contrary to what the Russian representative earlier said, according to the UN, over half of exports went to developing countries, and the proportion of wheat exported to least developed countries, including sub-Saharan Africa, remained largely unchanged from pre-war levels. Furthermore, Ukraine is one of the main suppliers of the World Food Programme, which, without this initiative, would now have to source its humanitarian assistance elsewhere at higher costs. The EU spared no effort to support the UN in reaching a deal and finding a compromise allowing the renewal. So we urge Russia to reconsider its decision and resume the implementation of the initiative. Let's not forget that the Black Sea Grain Initiative would not have been necessary if Russia had not started the full-scale war against Ukraine and blocked Ukrainian Black Sea ports. In addition to the grain initiative, the EU solidarity lanes remain instrumental in bolstering global food security. They have allowed the export of more than 38 million tons of Ukraine's food and agricultural goods. The EU and the member states remain committed to addressing the needs of countries vulnerable to food insecurity. That is why we are providing 18 billion euros to address food security needs globally, focusing on the most vulnerable regions. We reiterate our call on all countries to step up their assistance in line with OCHA's humanitarian response plan and appeal for aid this year. Finally, on accountability, we remain firmly committed to ensure that Russia is held fully accountable for its war of aggression against Ukraine. The International Center for the Prosecution of Crime of Aggression against Ukraine has started its support operations in The Hague. The work to establish a tribunal for the prosecution of the crime of aggression against Ukraine will continue. We welcome the adoption of the Ljubljana and The Hague Convention on International Cooperation in the Investigation and Prosecution of the Crime of Genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and other international crimes, and call on all countries to become parties to the convention as soon as possible. We also welcome the establishment of the Council of Europe's Register for damage caused by the aggression and calls for work to continue in line with the resolution of the UN General Assembly. Mr. President, we need a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine in line with the UN Charter and the resolutions of the General Assembly. We will continue to provide strong financial, economic, humanitarian, military, and diplomatic support to Ukraine and its people for as long as it takes. I thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Skog for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.